Hey there, friend. Tonight we'll set sail together into the oldest story Egypt ever told. A story whispered in tomb walls, carved in temple stone, and passed down for thousands of years. Before we begin, a quick note. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, consider subscribing. No rush, no pressure, just a way for us to spend more nights together, drifting through forgotten worlds by candlelight. Now, let's get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, set your phone aside, even light a small candle if you have one. Let the flicker soften the room. The goal is to listen and to rest, not to strain or chase the details. I also like to imagine where you're listening from. Are you in a quiet room with rain tapping at the windows? Maybe lying in bed while the city hums faintly outside? Or curled in a dorm or a hotel halfway across the world? A little out of place but finding comfort in an old story. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here. Now, let's step backward, far backward, not just thousands of years, but into the very first moment, when there was no land, no sky, no temple, no Nile. You wake in a vast darkness. It isn't silence, there's the slow, heavy sound of water all around you, but it has no shore. This is Nun, the great chaotic ocean, the endless flood that existed before all things. It stretches without beginning or end, cold and shifting, without light or shape. You float there, waiting, almost as if creation itself hasn't decided what to do yet. Then slowly the water stirs. A small mound rises up, breaking the stillness. This is the first ground, the first thing that is not water. Egyptians called it Benben, a sacred hill. Imagine a pyramid's tip, but smaller, jutting out of the sea of darkness. It gleams faintly, a promise that there might be order here, that the chaos may be shaped. And on this mound, something stirs. A lotus flower grows, impossibly, out of nothingness. Its bud swells, and then at last, it blossoms wide. From its golden heart comes light, warm, dazzling, flooding across the waters. That light is not just light, but a being, Ra, the sun god. Ra rises from the lotus, his body glowing like the dawn. With him the first morning begins. Until this moment, there had been no time, only endless drifting. But Ra's light sets the first day in motion. He gazes at the chaos around him and begins to shape it. Alone through the sheer force of divine will, he calls forth his children. From his breath comes Shu, the god of air, the space between earth and sky. From his spit, or some say from his shadow, comes Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, the dew, and the rain. These two venture out into the chaotic waters to explore, leaving Ra momentarily alone. He waits, but time passes, what feels like an eternity, and they do not return. Fear gnaws at him. For the first time, the new god knows loneliness. From that ache, tears fall from his eyes, and wherever they strike the earth, human beings are born. We are, in the Egyptian imagination, children of divine sorrow, born from longing. When Shu and Tefnut at last return, Red's relief is so overwhelming that creation leaps forward again. From their union, the earth god Geber, the sky goddess Nut, are born. For now they cling together in an endless embrace. Sky pressed tightly against earth, leaving no room for life. Ra forces them apart, stretching Nut high above as the heavens, pressing Geber down below as the solid ground. Between them lies the open air where humans can live, farm, and breathe. And so the stage is set. Out of darkness and endless water, there is now land, sky, and light. But Rhodes rules supreme, for he is the first pharaoh, king not just of gods, but of the very structure of the world. The Nile flows as his gift. Animals walk the land and the sun's cycle begins. You can almost feel it. The relief of standing on earth for the first time after drifting in chaos. A sky overhead, blue and steady. The warmth of sunlight spreading across the fields. And yet, in the distance, a shadow. Ra senses it already. He knows that his descendants, the ones yet unborn, will one day rise against him. Creation is never still. It carries within it the seeds of struggle, of betrayal, of change. But for now the waters have parted, the world has begun, and you stand on the Benben stone at the very beginning of time. Creation had begun, but the cosmos was still fragile. From the still waters of Nun, Atum had brought himself into being. With his breath, with his spit, with his very body, he brought forth the first children, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. They were the first true pair, the beginning of duality in the world, dry and wet, breath and dampness, balance and opposition. Shu lifted himself tall and proud, his body invisible, but everywhere. He was the breeze over the desert, the breath in mortal lungs, the invisible thread holding heaven aloft. His sister Tefnut flowed with gentleness and power alike. She was the dew upon the grass, the humidity that clung to the air, the essence of fertility carried in mist and rain. Together they represented the first balance, the first complement, the first lesson of Egyptian myth, that nothing stands alone. But the young pair vanished into the dark waters of chaos, swallowed by Nun, as if creation had faltered. Atum wept for his children, tears falling from his eyes and striking the earth. Those tears became humanity itself, the first mortals born of divine grief. The Egyptians told this story to explain why humans were fragile, filled with sorrow, yet divine enough to carry sparks of the gods within them. Shu and Tefnut, however, were not lost forever. They returned from the waters, bringing with them the sense of order and structure that Tausum had desired. Their reunion with their father was celebrated, and from their union came the next divine pair, Geb, the god of earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. Geb was strong, fertile, and enduring. His skin was rich soil, sprouting vegetation wherever Osiris's blessings would later fall. Upon him rested mountains and valleys, rivers and stones. Nut was his equal in majesty, her body arched across the heavens, glittering with stars. She was both beautiful and terrifying, an endless dome that stretched across existence. Together they were inseparable, locked in an eternal embrace. Geb pressed upward, Nut bent downward, and they clung so tightly that there was no space between earth and sky. Darkness cloaked the world, for Nut covered Geb entirely, and creation could not breathe. It was Shu, their father, who was forced to intervene. With his arms he pried them apart, stretching Nut high above, pressing Geb down below. Between them he stood, forever the air that separates earth from sky. This act was painful, for Geb and Nut loved one another deeply, and longed for each other. Even in art, they are often shown reaching out, Nut arching overhead, her fingertips and toes brushing the edges of the world, while Geb lies below, stretching upward with longing. The daily cycle of day and night was understood as Nut swallowing the sun, each evening, and giving birth to it, each dawn, a reminder that even in separation, their union was eternal. But from their strained love came life itself. Nut, though forbidden by Ra to give birth on any of the 360 days of the year, found a way, with the aid of Thoth, who bargained with the moon to steal its light. 5 extra days were added to the calendar. On these sacred days, outside of Ra's decree, Nut gave birth to 5 children: Osiris, Horus the elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. These were not minor spirits or fleeting forces. They were the gods who would shape the entire destiny of Egypt. Osiris, noble and wise, would rule as the just king. Horus the elder would shine in the sky, with clarity of vision. Set, restless and stormy, would bring both destruction and necessary chaos. Isis, filled with compassion and cunning, would become the mistress of magic. Nephthys, quiet and shadowed, would walk the boundary between life and death. Ra's suspicion at their birth was not without cause. These children represented change, renewal, and challenge to his authority. Already, the seeds of conflict and destiny were being sown. But before their dramas unfolded, the Egyptians saw in this moment the foundations of their world: earth below, sky above, air in between, moisture and breath, sustaining it all. Creation was no longer empty, it had texture, form, tension, and life. The great cosmic family had taken shape, and from their struggles all things would emerge. Stand now in that mythic world, as the Egyptians imagined it. Sheb lies beneath your feet, solid and fertile. Nut stretches above, jeweled with stars. Shu, unseen, fills your lungs with every breath. Moisture clings in the air, Tefnut's gift. The children of sky and earth stir within the world, their presence already reshaping existence. The cosmos was no longer a lonely god floating on primeval waters. It was a living family, bound by love, tension, and destiny. And as the Egyptians knew well, family could bring harmony, but also strife. The stage was set, the earth was steady, the sky secure, the air flowing, the waters moist. The next act of the story would not be about the making of the world, but about what happens when gods themselves struggle for power. The cosmos had taken form, but it was still incomplete. Sheb, the earth, lay firm and fertile below. Nut, the sky, arched glittering above. Yet they clung too tightly together, pressed in an eternal embrace. There was no space for life to breathe, no room for creation to flourish. Darkness blanketed everything beneath Nut's starry body, while Geb's rich soil remained barren, smothered by her weight. It was Shu, their father, who answered the call of balance. With great force he pried them apart, pushing Nut high above, pressing Geb down below. His arms became the pillars of air, holding sky and earth apart forever. In art, the Egyptians showed him as a man standing tall, arms stretched upward, separating his parents. Though this brought grief, Geb reached upward in longing, Nut arched downward in sorrow. The separation was necessary. Without space, there could be no creation. This painful act established the order of the cosmos, earth below, sky above, air between. It was the foundation upon which all of Egypt's myths would rest. The Egyptians saw the daily cycle as an echo of this struggle, Nut swallowing the sun each evening and giving birth to it each dawn, never touching Geb yet, forever bound to him through their children. For Nut's womb swelled with life. In her body stirred the seeds of a new generation of gods. This should have been a moment of joy, yet Ra, the aging but still mighty sun god, foresaw danger. He gazed down upon Nut and felt dread. The children she carried, he realized, would one day challenge him, threatening his throne. And so Ra issued a decree. Nut would not be permitted to give birth on any day of the year. His command bent time itself. The year was set at 360 days, each sealed and forbidden. On no day could a child of Nut be born. It was a sentence of eternal pregnancy, a cruel stalling of creation. Imagine Nut's grief, her body heavy with life, yet unable to bring it forth. Within her womb, the children pressed and kicked, eager to emerge, yet trapped by the decree of the sun. The world itself seemed to pause, caught in Ra's fearful grip, but the cosmos had a god of cunning, one who thrived where rules became snares. He understood time and fate as no other did, and he saw in Ra's decree not a wall but a puzzle. Thoth turned to Khonsu, the moon god, whose light rivaled that of Ra. With sly words, Thoth proposed a game of Senet, the ancient board game of chance and strategy. Khonsu, proud and radiant, agreed, but each wager was high. Thoth demanded slivers of Khonsu's light with every loss. Game after game, Thoth triumphed. Piece by piece, Khonsu's brilliance was shaved away, until the moon no longer shone with fullness, but dwindled into crescents. From those fragments of light, Thoth shaped something new. 5 extra days, days that stood outside Ra's calendar. They were hidden in the seams of time, loopholes beyond the reach of his decree. On these secret days, Nut's children at last could be born. Each day opened like a door, and through it stepped a god or goddess who would shape the destiny of Egypt. On the first day came Osiris, noble and steady, destined to rule fertility, vegetation, and kingship. His birth brought order and growth. Green sprouted where his presence lingered. On the second day came Horus the elder, linked with the bright sky and clarity of vision, a falcon soaring above creation. On the third day was born Set, fierce and restless, his cries shook the air, and even as an infant, he radiated violence and storm. He belonged to the deserts, the barren lands, the chaos of sandstorms and shifting winds. On the fourth day arrived Isis, radiant with cunning and compassion. Her presence was magnetic, her mind sharp. She was destined to become mistress of magic, healer and protector of kings. And on the fifth day came Nephthys, shadowy and solemn. She embodied twilight, morning, and the mysteries of the in-between. These 5 children, Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis and Nephthys, formed the sacred family whose dramas would define Egypt's mythology. Their births brought both celebration and unease. For though Ra's decree had been broken, his prophecy still loomed. From these children would come the challenge to his rule. As they grew, their natures began to unfold. Osiris walked with calm wisdom, his presence bringing fertility to fields and justice to men. Isis learned the ways of healing and sorcery, her devotion to her family unwavering. Nephthys drifted quietly toward the shadows, comforting the dead and standing in liminal spaces. Horus the Elder gazed from the skies, ever watchful, and Set, restless, jealous, chaotic, delighted in the barren deserts, in storms and upheaval. The Egyptians saw in these divine siblings a reflection of their own land. The fertile Nile Valley, with its crops and abundance, belonged to Osiris. The harsh red deserts, hostile and dangerous, were the domain of Set. Life itself was defined by their balance, green fields sustained by the floodwaters, but always threatened by the encroaching sands. Meanwhile, Ra's unease deepened. He had bent time itself to prevent their birth. But Thoth had outwitted him. The new gods had come into the world, despite his command, and their power only grew. Ra's reign, once unquestioned, began to waver under the weight of prophecy. Change had been born, and even the sun could not hold it back. Priests told this tale, not only as a story of gods, but as a lesson. No decree, no matter how mighty, could halt the cycles of life. Even Ra, the greatest of the gods, could not resist the inevitability of birth and renewal. Change was woven into the cosmos itself. Stand now in this mythic landscape. Geb lies beneath, fertile and waiting. Nut arches above, jeweled with stars, her children finally freed from her womb. Ra's watches warily from his throne, the weight of prophecy heavy upon him. The 5 children walk the earth, each bearing the seeds of destiny. And already shadows gather, for where there is birth, there will be struggle. The births of Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder had changed the balance of creation. Ra, the great sun god, still ruled the cosmos, his light blazing across sky and earth. Yet his supremacy was no longer absolute. Where once he had reigned unchallenged, now there stood younger gods, strong and vital, born beyond his will. Ra was radiant still, but age had begun to weigh upon him. His body no longer glowed with youthful fire. Lines creased his golden face, and the saliva that dripped from his mouth was a reminder that even the sun was not untouched by time. For the Egyptians, this was no insult but a truth. Even gods bore the burden of decay. Ra's aging mirrored the setting sun, descending each day into the Duat. As Ra weakened, cracks formed in his rule. He had tried to prevent Nut from bearing children, and failed. His decree had been outwitted by Thoth. His suspicion now fell heavily upon Nut's children, especially Osiris, whose steady wisdom and fertility drew admiration from gods and mortals alike. Ra sensed that his own reign would not last forever. Osiris and Isis, meanwhile, were growing into their roles. Osiris walked among men, teaching them to plant and harvest, to build and prosper. He brought barley and wheat to the valley, showing that the floods of the Nile could be harnessed to feed all. Isis, ever devoted, gave knowledge of healing, spells, and the binding of wounds. Together they became beloved, symbols of harmony between gods and humans. But Set, the stormy brother, looked upon Osiris with envy. He had inherited the deserts, the barren places, the storms and chaos. His nature was wild, his heart restless, his power great but untamed. The love mortals showed Osiris stung him. Where Osiris ruled with justice and abundance, Set saw only his own isolation, bound to desolation and jealousy. Ra, seeing their rivalry, was both watchful and weary. He could not intervene forever. Each day he sailed his solar bark across the sky, the crew of gods guiding him by day and defending him by night against Apophis, the serpent of uncreation. But as his strength waned, the task became heavier. The daily battle against Apophis was more than a story, it was a truth the Egyptians felt with each dawn. Every night, Ra entered the Duat, the realm of the dead, where Apophis rose from the waters of Nun to coil around the bark. The serpent's body was endless, its scales like iron, its jaws wide enough to swallow the sun. With each attack, the universe itself trembled. Only through the combined strength of the gods, Set standing at the prow with spear in hand, Isis chanting spells, Mat steadying the balance, was Apophis driven back. And Ra rose again at dawn, yet the struggle repeated nightly. Ra could never destroy Apophis completely. Chaos could be pushed back, but never eradicated. It was here that the Egyptians found one of their deepest truths. Life was not a battle won once, but a struggle renewed forever. Order had to be maintained, defended, upheld, every day. As Ra's frailty grew, Isis saw opportunity. She was more than healer and mother. She was cunning, clever, the greatest sorceress among the gods. She understood that power lay not only in strength, but in knowledge, and she began to gather secrets. Ra carried within him a hidden name, a word of ultimate power that defined his very essence. None knew it but himself. With that name, Isis could claim a share of his authority. Her chance came when she saw the saliva of Ra drip onto the earth. She gathered it with dust, molded it into a serpent, and laid it where Ra walked. When the snake bit him, venom seared his body. Ra staggered, groaning in agony. None of the gods could cure him, for no spell was strong enough. Isis approached, feigning compassion. "Tell me your name," she whispered, "and I will heal you." Ra spoke his titles, his forms, his glories, but not the secret name. The venom burned deeper, his light flickered. At last, unable to bear it, Ra surrendered, whispering the true name into Isis's ear. With this knowledge, she spoke the words that drew the poison out, saving him, but also binding him. She had claimed a portion of his essence, his power, his authority. From that moment, Isis's place among the gods was unmatched. She was no longer merely wife or mother, but mistress of divine magic. Ra endured, still ruling, but his grip on the cosmos weakened further. The younger gods rose in prominence, their dramas unfolding while the old sun god drifted toward decline. This moment in the myths was not simply about power struggles among gods. For the Egyptians, it reflected the reality of succession, the passing of rule from one generation to the next. Pharaohs aged and died, their children inheriting the throne. Ra's faltering was not failure, but inevitability, a truth of existence. Even the sun god was bound to the cycle of time, and so the stage was set for conflict. Osiris, wise and just, was beloved of mortals. Isis, cunning and powerful, held secrets none could match. Nephthys lingered in the shadows, her role still unfolding. Set grew restless, his jealousy simmering like a storm over the desert. Ra, though still radiant, stood increasingly apart. His days were consumed by the endless war with Apophis, his strength sapped, his authority fraying. The new gods carried within them the future of Egypt, and the old order could not last forever. Picture this world as the Egyptians imagined it. The sun glows above, carried in Ra's bark, but its light flickers, strained by venom and age. On the earth below, Osiris teaches men to plant and reap. Isis whispers spells of healing, Set prowls the deserts with restless fury, and Nephthys waits in twilight. The air feels tense, charged, as if the cosmos itself knows what is to come. For soon the drama will turn to betrayal. Brother will rise against brother, and the first great tragedy of Egyptian myth will unfold. Ra's strength was fading, his venomous wound healed by Isis, yet his power diminished. Though he still blazed across the sky, it was no longer he who drew the admiration of gods and mortals alike. A new figure stepped into prominence. Osiris, firstborn of Nut, steady and wise. Osiris possessed a calm authority that contrasted with the restless storms of his brother Set. Where Set thrived in disruption, Osiris flourished in order. He inherited the fertile valleys, the black soil enriched by the floods of the Nile, and his nature matched his realm. Under his care, the barren wastes bloomed with green, and men learned that the earth could be tamed. The Egyptians said it was Osiris who first taught mortals the arts of civilization. Before him, people had lived in ignorance, wandering the wilds, feeding on roots and raw flesh. Osiris gave them wheat and barley, teaching them how to plant, reap, and store. He showed them the plow, the sickle, and the granary. Under his rule, the Nile's floods became not destruction but promise, its waters harnessed to nourish the land. He also gave them laws. Violence and theft, once unchecked, were curbed. Disputes were settled with fairness. Justice was no longer a whim but a measure by which all lived. Osiris ruled as the embodiment of Mat, truth, order, and harmony. His voice was calm, his judgment steady, his presence like the green sprouting after the flood. At his side stood Isis, his sister and queen. If Osiris was law and fertility, Isis was devotion and wisdom. She healed the sick, comforted the grieving, and taught women the arts of weaving and medicine. But beyond her tenderness lay her cunning. She studied the hidden powers of the cosmos, learning the secrets of words, names, and spells. Together, Osiris and Isis formed a balance, he the steady king, she the clever queen. Under their reign, Egypt flourished, fields ripened, granaries filled, temples rose. The people rejoiced, for life had become abundant and secure. They looked upon Osiris not only as king, but as a god who had brought them from savagery to civilization. His reign was remembered as a golden age, the time when Egypt became more than land. It became a kingdom. But harmony rarely endures unchallenged. In the shadows lurked Set, Osiris's brother. While Osiris ruled the fertile valley, Set was given the deserts, the red lands of sand, storms, and barrenness. He prowled his harsh domain, discontent festering in his heart. The praise showered upon Osiris stung him like venom. Why should Osiris rule the lush black soil, while he was left with emptiness? Why should Osiris's name be sung while his own was feared? The Egyptians knew Set well, for he was both necessary and dangerous. He embodied the desert winds that stripped fields bare, the storms that shattered houses, the violence of chaos always threatening order. Yet without him, there could be no balance. Just as night followed day, and drought followed flood, Set was a truth of existence. Still, jealousy twisted him. He looked upon Osiris and Isis with resentment. Their love and devotion mocked his own loneliness, for his union with Nephthys was barren, lacking harmony. Their power, their adoration, their prosperity, all fed the fire of his envy. Yet for a time, Osiris remained unchallenged. He did not see the storm building. He trusted too deeply, believing his brother merely restless, not dangerous. Perhaps he thought Met itself would keep chaos at bay, but Set was not bound by justice or harmony. He was chaos given form, and chaos waits only for opportunity. The myths tell that Osiris did not confine his gifts to Egypt alone. He traveled far, carrying the plow and the sickle to distant lands, teaching even foreign peoples the ways of cultivation and order. Wherever he walked, wildness softened, harvests grew, and peace replaced savagery. He did not conquer by spear, but by knowledge and justice. His conquests were gifts, and his legacy spread beyond the Nile. In his absence, Isis guarded the throne, her vigilance keeping Egypt secure. She was more than consort, she was regent, protector, sorceress. Mortals and gods alike revered her, for in her shone a devotion stronger than iron. But Set watched and plotted. Each festival in Osiris's honor, each harvest reaped under his guidance, deepened Set's bitterness. He began to whisper in secret, to gather allies who longed for disruption, who envied Osiris's peace. The Egyptians told this story not only as divine drama, but as reflection of their own world. Egypt itself was divided between the fertile black land and the barren red desert. Osiris was the green floodplain, Set the scorching sands. Their rivalry was the eternal struggle between abundance and desolation, between harmony and chaos. Neither could be erased, both were part of existence. Picture Osiris now, seated upon his throne, crook and flail across his chest, his crown gleaming with white and red, uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. At his side sits Isis, radiant, her wings ready to spread in protection. Around them, mortals rejoice, their fields golden, their hearts grateful. It is a vision of perfection, of balance, of golden order. Yet behind the throne lurks Set, eyes narrowed, heart burning. He sees not harmony, but insult, not balance, but injustice. He sharpens his cunning, as one sharpens a blade. Already in his mind, he shapes a plot, a coffin of cunning design, a feast to mask betrayal, a murder to shatter the golden age. The Egyptians told these tales with both pride and warning. Civilization, law, and abundance were gifts, but they were fragile. Chaos never vanished, it only waited, and so even in the height of Osiris's reign, the seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The world was about to change. The reign of Osiris had transformed Egypt. Wheat rippled golden along the banks of the Nile, barley swelled in the fields, and justice reigned from the throne. Men and women praised the king who had led them from savagery into civilization, who ruled not with cruelty but with fairness. His queen, Isis, was beloved for her wisdom and compassion, and their reign together seemed unshakable. But Osiris's brother could not bear it. Set wandered his barren deserts, the red lands where nothing grew, the realm of sandstorms and scorching winds. Every festival in Osiris's honor was like salt in his wounds. The cheers of the people rang in his ears as mockery. The love Isis showed her husband burned him with envy. Set, the god of chaos, could not endure a kingdom so steeped in harmony. He began to plot. Set's cunning was as dangerous as his strength. He understood that Osiris trusted him, that his brother's heart was open and unsuspecting. Osiris, who judged men with fairness, could not imagine treachery so close to home. Set would use that trust as his weapon. One day he crafted a chest, a coffin of extraordinary beauty, fashioned from rare cedar, inlaid with gold and lapis, polished until it gleamed. Its dimensions were precise, not chosen at random but measured carefully to fit one man alone, Osiris. When the chest was ready, Set announced a great feast. He invited the gods and nobility, filled the hall with music and wine, laughter and song. Osiris came gladly, for he loved his brother still and saw no reason to doubt his welcome. The banquet was rich, and the wine flowed. At the height of the revelry, Set unveiled the chest. Gasps filled the hall at its beauty. "Behold," he cried, "a gift. Whosoever shall lie within this chest and fit it perfectly shall have it as his own." One by one, the guests tried. Some were too tall, some too short, others too broad or narrow. Each lay down and rose again, laughing, for none fit the chest as if it had been made for them. At last Osiris, amused, agreed to try. He lowered himself into the chest. It embraced him perfectly, every line and curve measured for his body alone. The guests marveled at the coincidence. But before Osiris could rise, the trap was sprung. Set and his conspirators slammed down the lid. Nails drove into wood, molten lead sealed the seams. Osiris cried out, but his voice was muffled. The chest became a coffin, a prison of gold and cedar. Without pause, Set's followers lifted it high, carried it to the Nile, and hurled it into the waters. The river swallowed it whole, bearing it away on the current, vanishing into the distance. Thus, the Golden Age ended in betrayal. The Egyptians told this story not only as a myth, but as a warning harmony, no matter how strong, is always threatened by envy and chaos. The Nile's fertile floods could be followed by drought. A kingdom could flourish yet fall through treachery. Order was never permanent. It was fragile, always at risk. Isis' grief was boundless. She tore her garments, let down her hair, and cried out to the heavens. Her beloved husband, the just king, was gone, murdered by his own brother, cast adrift upon the river. She vowed she would not rest until she found him. The chest drifted far, carried northward to the edge of Egypt, and beyond into the marshlands of Byblos. There it lodged among the branches of a great tamarisk tree. The tree grew swiftly, encasing the chest within its trunk, hiding it from all eyes. In time, the king of Byblos came upon the tree, struck by its beauty, and ordered it cut down to become a pillar in his palace. Within that pillar, sealed in wood, Osiris's coffin remained hidden. Meanwhile, Set took the throne. He claimed the crown of Egypt, declaring himself king. His rule was the opposite of Osiris's. Where Osiris had brought justice, Set brought tyranny. Where Osiris had brought fertility, Set brought barrenness. Storms raged, violence spread, and fear shadowed the land. The Egyptians saw in this myth the reflection of their own lives. The black land of the Nile, fertile and green, was Osiris's gift. The red desert, harsh and merciless, was Set's domain. The crops withered, families suffered, and order faltered. But Isis was not broken. Her grief became determination. She disguised herself and journeyed far, searching every riverbank, every marsh, every land, guided by whispers of hope. Her journey was not yet complete, for Set's malice did not end with Osiris's death. But in this first act of betrayal, the stage was set for the great struggle that would define Egyptian myth, the battle between order and chaos, between the just king and the usurper, between life and death itself. Picture the moment as the Egyptians imagined it. The coffin of Osiris drifts on the Nile, its golden surface gleaming beneath the water. The stars above wheel silently, not watching with sorrow as her child is borne away. On the throne of Egypt sits Set, proud and fierce, his laughter echoing across the red lands. And in the shadows, Isis begins her long journey, a journey of devotion, magic, and grief that will reshape the cosmos. The golden age of Osiris was over, but from tragedy, new destinies would rise. The golden age had ended in silence. Egypt no longer sang the praises of Osiris. His throne had been seized, his body stolen, his people left in fear beneath the shadow of Set. Storms raged more fiercely, deserts encroached upon the fields, and families looked to the horizon with dread. Yet amid this darkness, Isis rose not as a queen seated in glory, but as a widow in mourning, relentless in devotion. The coffin of Osiris had drifted far, sealed in cedar and gold, hidden within a tamarisk tree that grew tall in the foreign land of Byblos. No one in Egypt knew where he had gone, but Isis refused despair. Her grief became her strength, her love her compass. She swore that she would find him. No matter the distance, she wandered through the marshes, the deserts, the mountains, and the sea. Disguised as a mortal woman, she questioned travelers, listened to rumors, and followed whispers. Some myths say she carried a simple staff, walking alone through the wilderness. Others say she transformed into a swallow, flying over rivers and villages, her cries echoing with sorrow. Wherever she went, the people felt her presence as both lament and blessing. She wept for Osiris, yet healed the sick, soothed children, and offered her wisdom to strangers. Her journey led her to Byblos, a land of cedar and sea. There she learned of a great tree in the king's palace, a tree whose trunk encased something wondrous. The king had ordered it, cut and shaped into a pillar, its fragrance filling the halls, its beauty admired by all. But Isis, with her keen intuition, knew what lay hidden within. She approached the queen of Byblos, offering her service as nursemaid to the royal children. Each night, Isis laid her hands upon the infants, breathing divine strength into them. Some tales say she placed them in fire, intending to burn away their mortality and grant them immortality, only to be interrupted before the rite was complete. Others say she simply sang to them, her voice a lullaby older than time. Whatever the truth, the queen felt awe for the mysterious nurse who seemed more goddess than woman. At last, Isis revealed her nature. With reverence, the king and queen gave her the tamarisk pillar. She split it open, and within lay the coffin of Osiris. Her beloved at last returned to her arms. She wrapped herself around the coffin, keening with sorrow, her tears falling upon the wood. She carried it back to Egypt, her heart burning with hope that death might not be the end. But Set was watchful. He discovered Isis's secret, and in a fury seized the coffin once more. Dragging Osiris's body from its resting place, he committed an act so cruel it shook the cosmos. With blade in hand, he hacked the corpse into pieces. Some say 14, others 16 or more, scattering them across the length of Egypt, into the Nile, into the marshes, into the desert winds. The fragments of Osiris were flung, lost to the land he had once ruled. This was no mere murder. To the Egyptians, it was desecration, an assault upon the very fabric of Maat. To be buried whole was essential for the soul's journey into the afterlife. To be dismembered, scattered, forgotten, this was annihilation. Set did not simply kill Osiris, he tried to erase him from eternity. Yet Isis did not yield. With her sister Nephthys, loyal despite being Set's wife, she began a second greater search. Together the two goddesses became seekers of fragments, mourners of the lost. They combed the length of Egypt, guided by devotion and by the cries of jackals, symbols of Anubis, the god of embalming. Where a piece of Osiris had fallen, they built shrines, and these places became centers of worship that would endure for centuries. Some myths tell that the fish of the Nile devoured one piece, the phallus, and that it was lost forever. Yet Isis, undeterred, fashioned a substitute through magic, restoring her husband's body as completely as she could. Her grief did not paralyze her. It became the engine of miracles. The Egyptians looked upon Isis's quest as more than myth. She was the model of devotion, of loyalty beyond death. Wives wept for their husbands, mothers for their sons, sisters for their brothers, and in Isis they saw their own mourning sanctified. At funerals, women played the role of Isis and Nephthys, wailing beside the body, embodying the goddesses who had sought Osiris. Through their searching, Isis and Nephthys gathered the pieces. They reassembled Osiris's broken form, laying him upon a bier, wrapping him in linen, anointing him with oils. It was Isis's magic, however, that breathed life again. In secret, she transformed into a bird, spreading her wings over him, fanning life back into his body. From this union came Horus, the falcon, the avenger yet to rise. But Osiris did not return to the world of the living. His time as king of earth had ended. Instead, he descended into the Duat, the underworld, where he would reign forever as judge of the dead. He became the green-skinned god, crowned with the Apophis, holding crook and flail, enthroned in eternal shadow. Every soul that died would stand before him, and his verdict would decide their fate. Set remained on the throne of Egypt, defiant and proud. But Isis's devotion had preserved Osiris from oblivion, and through Horus, their son, a new hope was kindled. The struggle between order and chaos was far from over. It had only begun. Picture the mythic land now, shrines scattered across Egypt, each said to hold a piece of Osiris. Women wail in mourning, priests chant spells of resurrection. The Nile flows red with memory of betrayal. In the Duat, Osiris sits enthroned, the first of the dead, serene yet powerful. And in the marshes, Isis nurses her infant, hiding him from Set's gaze, raising the avenger who will one day confront the usurper. The Egyptians saw in this myth not only gods but their own truth. Death is never final, mourning is never fruitless, and from devotion can come renewal. Set had scattered Osiris, but Isis had gathered him again. Out of dismemberment came rebirth, out of despair came hope, and out of death came eternity. Osiris had descended into the Duat, enthroned as king of the dead. Set sat on the throne of Egypt, ruling with violence and fear. Yet Isis had accomplished what seemed impossible. She had preserved Osiris's essence, conceived a child, and ensured that hope for the future lived on. This child, Horus, would become the avenger, the heir, the falcon, destined to challenge Set and restore balance. But for now, he was only a vulnerable infant, fragile as any human child, dependent upon his mother's devotion. Isis carried him into hiding. She knew Set would stop at nothing to destroy the boy. If the usurper king learned of Horus's birth, he would strike swiftly, ensuring no rival could ever threaten him. So Isis fled to the marshes of Chemis, a labyrinth of papyrus and reeds, where the Nile spread into pools and channels too treacherous for pursuers. There she built a secret refuge, her dwelling concealed among the tall green stalks, water lapping softly around her. Life in exile was harsh. The marshes were damp, filled with biting insects, snakes coiled in the reeds, and crocodiles gliding beneath the water. Isis endured all of it to protect her son. She lived not as a queen in a palace, but as a mother in solitude, gathering herbs for food, weaving mats for shelter, keeping constant watch. But danger found them still. In one tale, Set discovered Horus's hiding place and sent scorpions to sting the child. The venom burned in his tiny body, and Isis, frantic, called out for aid. Her cries reached the ears of the goddess Serket, protector against venom, and of Thoth, the wise. Together they came, speaking spells, cooling the fever, drawing the poison out. Horus's life was saved, but Isis's terror was seared into memory. In another tale, a snake struck while Isis turned briefly away. The infant falcon lay pale and still, his breath faltering. The gods gathered around, anxious, for the child's fate was bound to the destiny of the cosmos. It was Thoth again who bent low, speaking words of power, commanding the venom to depart. At his command, Horus stirred, life flowing back into his body. The lesson was clear: even gods required protection, and destiny, no matter how certain, could be threatened by chaos. Yet Isis was not alone. The marshes were filled with those loyal to her cause. 7 scorpions became her companions, fierce guardians that crawled beside her, their stingers ready to strike at any who threatened mother and child. At night, Isis whispered to them, naming each, reminding them of their duty to protect the heir of Osiris. The Egyptians loved these stories, for they showed their goddess not in glory, but in struggle. Isis was a mother like any other, fearful, exhausted, desperate to shield her child from harm. She endured isolation, hunger, and constant threat, yet her devotion never wavered. Every Egyptian mother could look to her and see a reflection of her own fears and hopes. Meanwhile, Horus grew. He was not only fragile but divine, and his nature revealed itself even in childhood. His eyes gleamed with the light of the sun and the moon, the right eye burning like Razra's disk, the left glowing silver like Thoth's crescent. When he opened them, light spread over the marshes. When he closed them, darkness returned. The Egyptians would later call these the eyes of Horus, symbols of protection, healing, and wholeness. Even as a child, Horus was restless, testing his strength against the world around him. He chased birds through the reeds, splashed against the current, and watched the falcons wheel above, sensing that their wings mirrored his own destiny. Isis, watching, felt both pride and fear. She knew he was meant for greatness, yet she feared the dangers that lay ahead. The myths also tell of Nephthys, Isis's sister, who came often to aid her. Though bound to Set in marriage, Nephthys remained loyal to Osiris's line. She brought food, offered comfort, and watched over Horus when Isis wandered in search of herbs and charms. Her presence reminded Isis that she was not alone, that even in grief and exile, loyalty endured. Set, however, did not forget. He searched constantly, prowling the deserts and rivers, his storms howling as if to flush them from hiding. But the marshes of Chemis resisted him. The reeds whispered with Isis's magic, the waters deepened against his steps, and the creatures of the marsh turned against him. Time and again he hunted, yet he returned empty-handed. The child lived, hidden and guarded. In Egyptian temples, priests recited spells from these tales to protect children. Mothers invoked Isis's name to shield their infants from snakes and fever. Amulets in the form of the Eye of Horus were placed around the necks of the vulnerable, symbols of the divine child who had survived poison and danger. These were not distant myths, but living prayers woven into the daily lives of the people. Picture the scene as the Egyptians did, a small hut of reeds hidden deep in the marshes. Inside, Isis rocks her child, her voice a low song of ancient power. Outside, the papyrus sways in the wind, concealing their refuge. Scorpions crawl silently in the shadows, guardians ready to strike. The moon glimmers on the water, and in its silver light, the infant's eyes glow softly, one golden, one pale, both radiant with destiny. Horus was not yet the avenger, not yet the warrior who would challenge Set. For now he was only a child, fragile, yet filled with divine potential. But already the forces of chaos had sought to destroy him, and already he had survived. In his survival, the Egyptians saw their own children born into danger, saved by devotion, destined to grow strong. The time of confrontation had not yet come, but it was approaching. For each day Horus grew, Set's shadow lengthened. The balance between order and chaos would soon be tested in a struggle that would shake the cosmos. The marshes of Chemis had sheltered Horus through his fragile youth. Isis, vigilant and unwavering, had guarded him against poison, storm, and pursuit. Now the child of Osiris was grown, no longer a babe swaddled in reeds, but a falcon-eyed youth, strong of limb and fierce of spirit. His shoulders broadened, his voice deepened, and the strength of kingship flowed in his blood. The time for concealment was ending. The time for reckoning was near. For Set still ruled upon the throne of Egypt. His crown gleamed with stolen authority. His voice thundered with command. His storms tore across the land. He had scattered Osiris's body and usurped the kingdom. And though Isis had preserved her son, the people lived under the weight of chaos. Fear gnawed at the black land. The floods came uncertainly, and the deserts pressed closer each year. The balance of Mart trembled. Horus stood now as heir, the rightful king, the avenger of his father. The gods themselves watched with anticipation, for the outcome of his struggle with Set would shape not only Egypt, but the order of the cosmos. The first moves of their contest were not made with sword or spear, but in words before the divine tribunal. Isis, wise in speech as in magic, brought her son before the council of gods. Ra was present, weary but still radiant. Thoth recorded the proceedings, and the elder gods assembled to judge. Isis declared that Horus was the rightful heir of Osiris, born of their sacred union, destined to take the throne. Set rose in fury, his voice booming like desert thunder. "The throne is mine," he declared. "I seized it by strength, and I defend it by might. This boy is untested, unproven, a fledgling falcon against a lion. Shall Egypt fall into weakness under his hand?" The council hesitated. Ra, who favored Set for his strength in battling Apophis, leaned toward the usurper. Yet others, moved by Isis's words and Osiris's legacy, favored Horus. The matter was not settled. Judgment would come not in words alone, but in deeds. Thus began the contendings of Horus and Set, a struggle that would last 80 years, filled with battles, contests, and cunning tricks. Their first clash was upon the waters. Horus took to a boat, fashioned for war, its prow carved like a falcon's beak. Set appeared as a mighty hippopotamus, his massive body surging through the river. For days they fought, Horus with spear in hand, Set with tusks and jaws, the Nile churning with their fury. At last Isis intervened, casting a harpoon that struck Set, but compassion stirred in her heart. She could not bear to slay her brother. She loosened the weapon, letting him live. Horus, enraged by her mercy, turned on his mother, severing her head in fury. The gods gasped, but Thoth restored her, fashioning a head of cow's horns. The tale was a grim reminder. Even among gods, vengeance clouded joys, and mercy could breed anger. In another contest, they transformed into animals, Set into a red bull, Horus into a white one. They locked horns, gouging earth and sky alike, until Horus wounded Set and claimed victory. Yet still the council did not decide, for each triumph was met with new dispute. Set, cunning as ever, sought to undermine Horus, not only by strength, but by humiliation. One tale tells how he attempted to assert dominance by luring Horus into a trap of shame, but Isis, cunning beyond all, outwitted him. She gathered his seed, cast it into the river, and placed Horus's instead upon Set's brow. When the gods assembled, Thoth summoned the seed to speak, and from Set's head came the voice of Horus, proving the falcon victorious. The court laughed, Set's pride shattered, his deceit exposed, but still the struggle continued. The Egyptians told these stories not as a single jewel, but as a cycle of trials, each reflecting a truth of existence. Horus and Set were not simply rivals for a throne, they were opposing forces of nature. Horus was the fertile valley, the steady flood, the order of kingship. Set was the desert storm, the barren red land, the chaos that threatened to consume. Their battle was eternal, for Egypt itself was always caught between green and red, flood and drought, life and death. And yet, Horus endured. His wounds were many. Set struck his eyes, blinding him, leaving one darkened and torn. But Thoth, healer and scribe, restored it, making it whole again. That eye, healed and shining, became the Wedjat, the eye of Horus, symbol of protection and restoration. Egyptians painted it on tombs, carved it into amulets, inscribed it on coffins, believing it could ward off harm and make the broken whole again. The myth of Horus's wounded and restored eye was not only divine drama, but daily comfort, a promise that what was shattered could be mended. Through long years, their battles raged. Sometimes Horus triumphed, sometimes Set, but the balance slowly shifted. Horus's endurance, his steadiness, his lineage, as son of Osiris, won him allies among the gods. Isis never ceased to weave her cunning, ensuring her son's claim was heard. Nephthys, ever loyal, stood with them, her grief for Osiris lending her strength. Set raged, but even he began to feel the weight of inevitability. The council pressed him, the gods wearied of his defiance, and the people of Egypt whispered Horus's name with hope. The Egyptians remembered these tales with solemnity, for they reflected their own lives. Every year the Nile flooded and receded, bringing fertility and then hardship. Every season they battled to keep their crops safe from sand and storm. Every reign of Pharaoh was a renewal of the struggle between Horus and Set, the balance between order and chaos. Picture Horus now, no longer a hidden child but a falcon warrior, eyes gleaming like sun and moon, spear in hand. Before him stands Set, massive and snarling, storm and desert incarnate. Around them gather the gods, their judgments hanging in the air. The throne of Egypt waits, empty, contested, its fate bound to the outcome of this divine war. The contendings had begun, and they would not end quickly, for the throne of Egypt was not a prize easily won. It was a reflection of the cosmos itself, a balance that could only be secured through trial, struggle, and sacrifice. For 80 years, the struggle between Horus and Set tore through the divine court. Again and again, they clashed, in the river, in the desert, in the tribunal of the gods. At times Set's fury seemed unbreakable. At others Horus's endurance shone brighter. Yet the conflict could not continue forever. The balance of Mate demanded resolution, and the throne of Egypt could not remain in dispute. The gods assembled once more in council. Ra presided, though age weighed on him. His light diminished from what it had once been. Thoth recorded each word, impartial and steady. Shu, Tefnut, Geb, and Not, sat in witness. Isis stood beside her son, her gaze fierce, her voice sharp with the memory of betrayal. Set, broad-shouldered and red-eyed, glared with defiance. Horus, tall and resolute, stood calm, the falcon crown already seeming to rest upon his brow. The council heard their claims. Set boasted of his strength, of his role in defending Re's bark against Apophis, of the chaos that kept balance sharp. Horus declared his right by birth, as the son of Osiris, rightful heir of the throne. Isis reminded them of Osiris's justice, of the order he had given mankind, of the continuity that could not be broken. At last, weary of endless debate, the gods turned to Neith, the ancient goddess of wisdom and war, to arbitrate. Her counsel was revered, her judgment sought when all others faltered. She listened, patient, weighing the words of both sides. Then she spoke. The throne belongs to Horus, son of Osiris. His bloodline marks him heir, his endurance has proven his worth. Yet Set too has value. Without him, the bark of Ra would falter, and chaos would overwhelm creation. Let Horus reign in Egypt, and let Set stand beside Ra, for warding off the serpent of uncreation. Her words carried the weight of inevitability. The council agreed, even Ra could not deny them, and the verdict was sealed. Horus was crowned king. He took upon his head the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the white crown of the south, and the red crown of the north, bound together as one. The falcon god spread his wings across the land, uniting the valley and the delta under his rule. Osiris had reigned as the first just king. Now Horus carried that legacy forward. Each pharaoh who followed would be seen as the living embodiment of Horus, heir to his victory, guardian of Mate. The coronation was not merely a political triumph, but a cosmic one. The Egyptians saw in it the eternal pattern. Chaos challenged order, yet order endured. Just as the Nile's flood brought both danger and fertility, just as the sun set each night, yet rose again, so too did the rightful king rise, after trial. The throne of Egypt was sanctified, bound forever to the myth of Horus and Set. Set did not vanish in disgrace. Stripped of Egypt's crown, he was given a new role, guardian of Ra's solar bark. Each night, as Apophis rose from the waters, vast and coiling, Set stood at the prow, with spear in hand. His fury, once turned against his brother, was redirected against chaos itself. Only Set's violence could pierce the serpent's scales. Only his ferocity could hold back the jaws that sought to swallow the sun. In this way, the Egyptians reconciled his nature, destructive, yes, but also indispensable. Chaos could never be destroyed, but it could be harnessed. Even Set had a place in the balance. For Horus, kingship brought both glory and burden. His reign was not merely over Egypt, but over the principle of divine order itself. Pharaohs who sat upon the throne, wore his crown, carried his crook and flail, and performed rituals in his stead. Each coronation was not only a political ceremony, but a reenactment of Horus's triumph, a renewal of the promise that chaos would never rule unchallenged. The myth also explained why pharaohs were falcons in life, but Osiris in death. While they lived, they were Horus embodiments of rulership, defenders of order. When they died, they became Osiris, kings of the underworld, judges of the dead, fathers of the next Horus who would ascend. The cycle of kingship mirrored the cycle of myth, life to death, death to life again. The Egyptians carried these truths into their daily lives. Farmers saw Horus in the steady rhythm of the flood and harvest, Set in the storms that tore across their fields. Priests invoked Horus's victory during rituals of coronation, reciting hymns that proclaimed Pharaoh as the living Horus. In temples, Set was honored as the defender against Apophis, his duality accepted rather than denied. Even common folk wore amulets of the Eye of Horus, believing that just as the falcon's eye was restored after injury, so too could health and wholeness return to their own lives. Picture the scene as the Egyptians imagined it. The gods gathered in solemn assembly, Ra's bark shining faintly behind them, the air heavy with judgment. Neith speaks, her voice steady, and the verdict falls like stone: Horus is king. Isis lifts her face, tears of triumph mingling with grief for all she has lost. Set scowls but bows, accepting his fate as warrior against Apophis. The double crown gleams upon Horus's brow, the falcon spreads his wings across Egypt, and the land breathes once more in relief. The long struggle had ended, yet its lessons endured. No victory was permanent. Order was always contested, yet balance could be restored, and rightful kingship could prevail. Through Horus's triumph, Egypt found not only a ruler, but a myth that bound its people together for millennia. Thus the saga of Osiris and Set reached its resolution. Osiris reigned below as king of the dead, Horus reigned above as king of the living, and Set defended the bark against chaos. The divine family was fractured but balanced, each playing a role in the eternal cycle. And from this balance, Egyptian kingship itself was born. For Horus, kingship brought both glory and burden. His reign was not merely over Egypt, but over the principle of divine order itself. Pharaohs who sat upon the throne, wore his crown, carried his crook and flail, and performed rituals in his stead. Each coronation was not only a political ceremony, but a reenactment of Horus's triumph, a renewal of the promise that chaos would never rule unchallenged. The myth also explained why pharaohs were falcons in life, but Osiris in death. While they lived, they were Horus embodiments of rulership, defenders of order. When they died, they became Osiris, kings of the underworld, judges of the dead, fathers of the next Horus who would ascend. The cycle of kingship mirrored the cycle of myth: life to death, death to life again. The Egyptians carried these truths into their daily lives. Farmers saw Horus in the steady rhythm of the flood and harvest, Set in the storms that tore across their fields. Priests invoked Horus's victory during rituals of coronation, reciting hymns that proclaimed Pharaoh as the living Horus. In temples, Set was honored as the defender against Apophis, his duality accepted rather than denied. Even common folk wore amulets of the eye of Horus, believing that just as the falcon's eye was restored after injury, so too could health and wholeness return to their own lives. Picture the scene as the Egyptians imagined it. The gods gathered in solemn assembly, Ra's bark shining faintly behind them, the air heavy with judgment. Neith speaks, her voice steady, and the verdict falls like stone: Horus is king. Isis lifts her face, tears of triumph mingling with grief for all she has lost. Set scowls but bows, accepting his fate as warrior against Apophis. The double crown gleams upon Horus's brow, the falcon spreads his wings across Egypt, and the land breathes once more in relief. The long struggle had ended, yet its lessons endured. No victory was permanent. Order was always contested, yet balance could be restored, and rightful kingship could prevail. Through Horus's triumph, Egypt found not only a ruler, but a myth that bound its people together for millennia. Thus the saga of Osiris and Set reached its resolution. Osiris reigned below as king of the dead, Horus reigned above as king of the living, and Set defended the bark against chaos. The divine family was fractured but balanced, each playing a role in the eternal cycle. And from this balance, Egyptian kingship itself was born. While Horus ruled the living, Osiris reigned in shadow. His body, reassembled by Isis, had not returned him to mortal kingship, but transformed him into something greater, sovereign of the Duat, the underworld, where every soul must travel after death. If Horus embodied the crown of the pharaoh in life, Osiris embodied the destiny that awaited every human being: death, judgment, and for the righteous, renewal. The Duat was no simple resting place. It was a vast realm of winding corridors, gates guarded by monsters, rivers of fire and endless darkness. Yet it was also fertile, like Egypt's own floodplain, for in the depths of shadow Osiris ruled as the green god, life springing even in death. The Egyptians believed that the setting sun was Ra sailing into the Duat, joining Osiris in the night before rising again. Thus the cycle of day and night mirrored the passage of death and rebirth. To reach Osiris's throne, a soul first faced the guidance of Anubis, jackal-headed guardian of the dead. He was not born from the great dramas of Osiris and Set, yet he became indispensable in their aftermath. Anubis had stood by Isis when she gathered her husband's body, had wrapped Osiris in linen, had invented embalming itself. Because of this, he was forever the embalmer, the protector of tombs, and the psychopomp who guided souls. The journey began at the tomb. Priests, wearing Anubis's mask, performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, touching the corpse with sacred tools so that the deceased could breathe, see, and speak in the afterlife. Without these rites, the soul could not awaken fully in the duat. Families wept and prayed, offering food and amulets to sustain the departed. The body was not seen as mere flesh, but as a vessel necessary for eternity, preserved through Anubis's art. Once within the duat, the soul faced the hall of judgment. Here stood Osiris upon his throne, green-skinned, crowned with the white Atef, crook and flail across his chest. Isis and Nephthys flanked him as mourners and guardians. Before him stretched the great scales of Maat, upon which every heart would be weighed. Anubis placed the heart, seen as the seat of memory, conscience, and desire, on one side of the scale. On the other, he set the feather of Maat, symbol of truth, balance, and order. Thoth, ibis-headed scribe, stood ready with his palette and reed pen to record the verdict. Silence fell as the scale balanced or tipped. If the heart was light, equal to or lighter than the feather, the soul was declared righteous. Thoth wrote the verdict, and Osiris welcomed the soul into the field of reeds, the paradise of the afterlife. There, the dead found themselves in an Egypt-perfected fields forever fertile, families reunited, the sun shining eternally. Farmers plowed without toil, fishermen cast nets into abundant waters, children played in joy. Death was not an end, but a return to harmony, life eternal in Osiris's realm. But if the heart was heavy, burdened by lies, violence, and betrayal, it tipped the scales downward. Waiting beside the judgment was Amit, the devourer, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, the most feared beasts of Egypt combined. With gaping jaws she swallowed the heavy heart, and the soul was annihilated, erased from existence. No torment followed, no second chance, only oblivion. This fate was feared above all, for to the Egyptians, non-existence was worse than suffering. The judgment of Osiris was not abstract morality, but the very structure of life. Just as Pharaoh ruled Egypt by upholding Mat, so too did Osiris rule eternity. Every lie, every cruelty, every injustice weighed the heart down. Every act of truth, kindness, and reverence kept it light. In this way, mortal life was preparation for the scales. To live in balance was to secure eternity. To live in chaos was to invite oblivion. Anubis's role did not end at judgment. He was invoked in tombs and prayers as guardian against desecration. Jackals prowled the edges of cemeteries, and their presence was taken as his watchful gaze. Amulets of his form were placed on mummies, prayers inscribed to call upon his protection. He was not feared like Set or Apophis. He was revered, a faithful guide, who ensured that the soul reached Osiris safely. The myth of Osiris's judgment shaped every aspect of Egyptian funerary practice. Coffins were painted with spells from the Book of the Dead, maps of the duat that instructed the soul how to pass each gate, how to speak the correct words to guardians, how to avoid dangers. Papyrus scrolls, tucked beside the body, bore these spells in detail. Wealthy families filled tombs with goods, bread, beer, tools, even furniture, believing they would be needed in the afterlife. Even the poorest placed a token offering, a shard of pottery or a small charm, hoping it would serve as sustenance in Osiris's realm. To the Egyptians, death was not terrifying in itself. What they feared was failing the judgment, having their heart devoured, their name forgotten. They believed a person lived as long as their name was spoken. Thus families carved names into stone, recited them in prayers, and kept them alive through generations. Memory was survival, and Osiris's judgment was its gate. Picture the hall as they imagined it. Torches flicker on golden walls inscribed with hymns. Anubis, solemn, places the heart on the scale. The feather gleams white. Thoth dips his pen, ready to write. Amit crouches, jaws open, eyes fixed. Osiris sits enthroned, silent but watchful, ruler not of fleeting days, but of eternity. The air is heavy with destiny. The soul waits, trembling, as truth itself decides. This vision was more than religion. It was the moral framework of Egypt. Pharaohs ruled as Horus in life, but in death they too became Osiris, facing judgment like any mortal. No one, not king nor peasant, escaped the scales. The myths reminded every listener, live in Mat, for the heart remembers, and eternity weighs all. Thus the cycle was complete. Osiris, slain by Set, mutilated, restored by Isis, had become the eternal judge. Horus reigned in the sunlight, Pharaoh upon the throne, but Osiris reigned in shadow, Pharaoh of the dead. Together, father and son embodied the two halves of existence, life and death, earth and underworld, day and night. While Osiris judged the dead in his throne room of shadows, another drama unfolded each night in the depths of the Duat. The sun itself was not simply extinguished at dusk. It traveled. When daylight faded and the world grew dark, the Egyptians believed Ra descended into the underworld, sailing in his bark across its perilous waters. This nightly voyage was the very pulse of existence, for if Ra did not emerge at dawn, life itself would perish. The Duat, through which he sailed, was a labyrinth of rivers, caverns, and gates. Its walls were guarded by serpents, fire-spitting deities, and monstrous guardians whose names had to be spoken correctly to pass. The Book of Gates and the Amduat, sacred funerary texts, mapped these realms in detail, 12 divisions, one for each hour of night, through which Ra and his crew traveled. At the prow of the solar bark stood mighty Set, spear in hand. Once the usurper of Osiris's throne, now he found his role as defender indispensable. Each night, he waited for the great serpent Apophis, embodiment of uncreation, who rose from the waters to strangle the bark. Apophis was vast, coiled like endless rivers, his body thick as mountains, his scales black as night. His eyes glowed with hatred, and his jaws could engulf the sun itself. No matter how often Ra defeated him, Apophis returned each night, eternal as chaos itself. When the serpent struck, the bark shook. The crew of gods strained at the oars, their chants rising to keep the vessel steady. Isis recited spells of power, weaving words that bound and weakened the serpent. Neith drew her bow, loosing arrows into his coils. Serket, goddess of venom, paralyzed him with her sting. But it was Set who delivered the decisive blow. With spear raised high, he struck at Apophis's head, tearing through scales of iron, driving the serpent back into the depths. Yet Apophis never died. His body hacked and burned, always regenerated, for chaos could never be destroyed completely. Each night, the struggle began anew, a cosmic truth that mirrored life on Earth. Just as floods returned, storms rose and deserts encroached, so too did Apophis return. Order was not a permanent victory, but a constant battle. For the Egyptians, this was no distant tale. Every sunrise was proof of Ra's triumph, every dawn a celebration that order had endured for another day. Priests performed rituals at temples, reciting spells to aid the bark, burning wax effigies of Apophis to weaken him. Farmers, waking to the sun, saw in it the renewal of life itself, grateful that the gods had once more driven back the serpent. But the night journey was more than a battle. It was also a passage of renewal. At midnight, Ra united with Osiris deep in the heart of the Duat. The living sun god and the dead king met as one, their powers combining. From Osiris, Ra received rejuvenation, the strength to rise again at dawn. From Ra, Osiris received the sun's light, ensuring that the dead shared in the cycle of rebirth. Together they embodied the eternal rhythm, death feeding life, life renewing death. This union explained why the Egyptians saw the pharaoh as Horus in life, and Osiris in death. Just as Ra descended each night to be renewed by Osiris, so too did every king die to become Osiris, ensuring continuity for his heir. Life and death were not opposites, but complements, bound together in cosmic necessity. The texts of the Duat described each stage of the journey in detail. In 1 hour, Ra passed through lakes of fire, guarded by gods with knives of flame. In another, he encountered mummies rising from their tombs, stretching out hands for light. At every gate, guardians demanded passwords, names, and incantations. Without the right words, the bark could not pass, and even Ra himself would be halted. Knowledge, therefore, was power. Priests memorized these names, inscribed them on tomb walls, and recited them for the dead, ensuring they could follow Ra's path safely. Set's role in this nightly voyage redeemed him in part. Though he remained the god of storms and chaos, his fury was turned outward against Apophis. Egyptians both feared and honored him, recognizing that his violence was necessary to preserve creation. Without Set, the serpent might devour the bark, plunging the cosmos into eternal night. Thus even the usurper had a place in balance. The myth also offered a profound reflection on time. The Egyptians did not see history as a straight line, but as cycles, flood and drought, sowing and harvest, life and death. Ra's nightly journey was the cosmic expression of this truth. Each evening darkness fell, each morning the sun returned. Each death was a descent into shadow, each burial a preparation for renewal. Existence was not about permanence, but about continuity, the assurance that order, though always challenged, always returned. Heka the bark, as the Egyptians did. Its golden hull gleams faintly in the darkness of the underworld, oars dipping into black waters. At the prow stands Set, spear raised, eyes fierce. Around him, gods chant and fight, their voices rising like a shield of sound. Ahead looms Apophis, endless coils surging, jaws wide enough to swallow light itself. The clash is thunderous, spear against scale, spell against chaos. And behind it all sits Ra, his form radiant but weary, waiting for the moment when dawn will break, and his bark will ascend once more into the sky. This vision was not just for gods, but for all Egyptians. To live was to struggle against chaos, to work the fields against drought, to build against the encroaching desert. To die was to descend into shadow, hoping to be judged worthy by Osiris, and carried in Ra's bark toward renewal. The nightly voyage reminded them that their lives were part of a greater rhythm, their struggles reflections of the eternal battle against Apophis. Thus the sun rose each day not as habit, but as triumph. Dawn was victory, noon glory, dusk sacrifice, and night the promise of rebirth. The cycle endured, and with it, Egypt. Ra's bark rose each dawn, proof that the journey through the Duat had been won again, that the serpent Apophis had been repelled. For the living, each sunrise was a blessing. For the dead, however, the great question remained. Once their heart had been weighed before Osiris, what awaited them beyond judgment? The answer was not torment or a fiery hell, but a place of perfection, the field of reeds. This realm was Egypt made eternal, the fertile black land of the Nile, transformed into paradise. Here, wheat grew taller than men, barley swayed forever in golden winds, and waters glistened under an eternal sun. Families reunited, friends embraced, and the sorrows of life dissolved. The field of reeds was not foreign or strange. It was home, perfected, life as it should be, without hunger, illness, or death. For the Egyptians, this vision was both comforting and demanding. It promised eternal joy, but only for those who had lived in Mut. Every action in life, every lie told, every kindness offered, weighed upon the heart. At death, no bribes could alter the scale. The judgment before Osiris was final, and only if the heart was light could one cross into the field of reeds. The Egyptians prepared for this journey with devotion. Tombs were not seen as resting places alone, but as portals to eternity. The dead required sustenance in the next world, just as in this one. Bread, beer, wine, figs, honey and meat were placed beside them, offerings renewed by families in rituals long after burial. The wealthiest filled their tombs with furniture, jewelry, and even models of servants to serve them in eternity. The poorest offered what they could, a loaf of bread, a clay jar of water, trusting that sincerity mattered as much as riches. Spells and prayers were essential. The Book of the Dead, a collection of hymns, incantations, and instructions, served as a guidebook for the soul. It taught the deceased what to say at each gate, how to address the guardians of the duat, how to avoid snares and dangers. Lines such as "I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not slain unjustly," were confessions of innocence, rehearsed not only for Osiris, but for the conscience of the living. One of the most famous of these declarations was the negative confession, where the soul stood before 42 judges, each representing a principle of Ma'at. To each the deceased proclaimed innocence. "I have not blasphemed. I have not polluted the water. I have not withheld bread." This was not abstract piety, but daily ethics. Every Egyptian knew the expectations, and every act was measured against them. The vision of paradise also required physical wholeness. For this reason, embalming and mummification were sacred acts. Anubis, who embalmed Osiris, became the patron of this art. Priests removed organs, dried the body with natron, wrapped it in linen, and adorned it with amulets. The scarab over the heart, the eye of Horus over the brow, protective charms at each limb. These were not superstitions, but safeguards, ensuring that the body, the Ka life force, the Ba soul, and the Ren name could all reunite in the afterlife. Without preservation, the soul risked wandering, unable to rest in the field of reeds. The Egyptians also believed the dead would need tools for work, for even in paradise the fields had to be tended. But in the field of reeds, labor was joy, not burden. Wheat grew in abundance, irrigation channels flowed endlessly, and harvests never failed. To aid in this eternal labor, families placed small figurines called ushabti in tombs. These magical servants would come to life when called, sparing the deceased toil if needed. Wealthy tombs contained hundreds, poorer burials might contain only one, yet even one was thought sufficient. In art, the field of reeds was depicted with calm order. The deceased is shown plowing, sowing, reaping, and feasting, accompanied by family. Gods wander freely among mortals. Osiris watches from his throne, and reed's light shines perpetually. The Nile flows eternally, not in flood or drought, but in balance, carrying boats filled with joy rather than fear. To the Egyptians, this paradise was not an escape from their world, but a continuation of it. Unlike other cultures that imagined heavens of radiant abstraction, they envisioned the afterlife as Egypt perfected. They did not long for something alien. They longed for what they already knew, freed from suffering. Memory played a vital role in entry. A person's name, their rend, had to be preserved. To be forgotten was to die a second death, excluded from eternity. Families carved names into stone, recited them in rituals, and offered food in their honor. As long as a name was spoken, the soul endured. For this reason, erasing a name was the greatest crime, for it condemned the soul to oblivion. Pharaohs like Hatshepsut and Akhenaten, whose names were chiseled away, were attacked not only in history, but in eternity itself. The field of reeds was therefore more than comfort. It was obligation. It urged Egyptians to live truthfully, to honor Matat, to preserve memory, to prepare the body, to feed the spirit. Life and death were part of a single cycle, and how one lived determined how one would die. Picture the field as they imagined it. The sun glows without heat. The sky stretches endlessly, not stars twinkling, even in daylight. Wheat towers above, golden and full, bending without breaking. Families sit together at tables laden with bread and beer. laughter echoing in the breeze. Boats drift down tranquil waters, their sails filled with wind. The soul walks among loved ones, at peace, forever in Osiris's care. The Egyptians looked upon this vision with hope. Death was inevitable, but despair was not. If one lived in Matat, spoke truth, honored gods and kin, preserved names, then eternity awaited in a land more familiar and strange, more fertile than any flood, more joyous than any festival. The field of reeds was their promise, life perfected, forever renewed. The field of reeds offered eternal peace for the righteous, but reaching it required more than a good heart and a light spirit. The Egyptian cosmos was threaded with a force older than gods themselves, a power that bound creation together and gave words their strength. They called it Heka, magic, but far more than trickery or illusion. Heka was the energy that Atum had drawn upon when he rose from Nun to shape the first gods. And it was the power Re carried in his secret name, the force Isis wielded to resurrect Osiris, the reason why spells and amulets could alter fate. For the Egyptians, magic was not supernatural, it was natural, the fabric of existence itself. Gods, humans, and even the dead used it. Without Heka, no prayer reached a god, no spell bound a serpent, no journey through the Doit was possible. The word itself meant to activate, to empower. Every ritual, every hymn, every carving in stone was infused with Heka. To speak a name was to summon its power, to inscribe a hieroglyph was to give it life. Statues of gods were not inert stone, but vessels animated by Heka, eyes painted to see, mouths opened in ritual, so they could breathe offerings. Bread and beer left in temples were believed to become filled with divine essence, through Heka, nourishing gods and mortals alike. Among all who wielded this force, Isis stood supreme. From the moment she tricked Re into revealing his secret name, she became mistress of divine magic. Her knowledge surpassed even Thoth's in certain tales, for while he recorded wisdom, she bent it to her will. Through Heka, she healed wounds, protected Horus, and raised Osiris from lifelessness. To her devotees, she was not just mother and queen but sorceress, patroness of spells, the embodiment of protective power. Isis' mastery of Heka was most vividly seen in her resurrection of Osiris. When she gathered his dismembered body, she did more than wrap linen and pour oils. She spoke the hidden words, the incantations that bound flesh to spirit, breath to bone. In her bird form, wings spread over him, she chanted spells that defied death itself. From this act, Egyptians believed magic could cross the boundary between life and death, a truth they carried into their own funerary rites. Yet Heka was not limited to the gods. Every Egyptian, from pharaoh to farmer, used it daily. Mothers whispered charms over children, binding them against snakes and fevers. Fishermen muttered prayers to the Nile before casting nets, ensuring abundance. Farmers inscribed protective symbols on granaries to ward off theft and rot. Soldiers carried amulets of the Eye of Horus, believing it would keep them whole in battle. Amulets were tangible Heka, concentrated in stone, faience, or metal. The scarab beetle symbolized rebirth, rolling the sun across the sky as it rolled its dung ball on earth. The Djed pillar stood for stability, linked to Osiris's spine. The Ankh represented life, eternal and unending. Each shape was more than ornament. It carried divine essence, a silent spell worn on the body. Temples were engines of Heka. Priests rose before dawn, bathed in sacred waters, dressed in clean linen, and recited long liturgies to awaken statues of gods. Incense filled the air, chants echoed in halls, and each word was power. Hymns described not only praise but transformation, turning offerings into divine sustenance, binding chaos, strengthening Maat. Without these rituals, the Egyptians believed, the balance of the cosmos would falter. The pharaoh, too, was master of Heka, for kingship itself was magical. By performing rituals, he maintained Manat across the two lands, ensuring the Nile flooded, the sun rose, and the borders held. He was Horus on earth, Osiris in death, but also a sorcerer king whose words sustained creation. Without his Heka, Egypt would collapse into disorder. But Isis remained the symbol of personal devotion. Stories tell how she wandered the earth, teaching spells to women and men, granting them the ability to heal, to protect, to resist misfortune. She was not distant but near, a goddess whose magic was available to the humble, as well as the mighty. Her cult spread beyond Egypt into the Mediterranean, where Greeks and Romans embraced her as the universal mother, her spells crossing language and culture. The myths also carried warnings. Heka was powerful, but it was not without danger. Words misused could backfire. Spells twisted by greed could harm the caster. The tale of Isis and Ra reminded listeners that magic was tied to knowledge, and knowledge to responsibility. To wield Heka recklessly was to upset balance, to invite chaos. The priests guarded much of its power, ensuring that sacred names and incantations remained controlled. To the Egyptians, magic was woven into the very texture of life and death. It was not separate from religion, but its essence. Every prayer, every carved sign, every ritual was an act of Heka. Even silence carried weight, for unspoken names and forgotten words meant power lost, existence diminished. Picture Isis now, standing in the marshes of Hemis, her child at her breast, her hands raised to the sky. Around her, scorpions coil, guardians bound by spell. Her voice rises in chant, words older than stone, words that ripple through air and water. She is not merely a grieving widow or devoted mother. She is Heka, incarnate, bending reality with her will, ensuring that chaos does not claim her son. And picture the ordinary Egyptian woman, whispering charms over her sleeping child. The farmer etching a scarab into the wall of his storehouse. The soldier binding the eye of Horus to his wrist. In each small act, they partook of the same power that Isis wielded, the same force that birthed gods and sustained the cosmos. Thus magic was not superstition, but survival, not trickery, but truth. It was the invisible current of creation, available to gods and mortals alike, binding Egypt together across generations. Heka was life, and through it, the Egyptians believed nothing was impossible. Magic, or Heka, wove the cosmos together, but in the temples of Egypt, order was embodied in another form, the divine family. The Egyptians saw the universe not as the rule of isolated deities, but as households of gods, triads of father, mother, and child, whose relationships mirrored those of humans. These sacred families reflected both the drama of myth and the ideals of harmony. Worshippers looked upon them not as distant abstractions, but as divine households to whom they could relate their own lives. The most famous of these families was the triad of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Their story had shaped Egypt's vision of kingship and the afterlife. At Abydos, one of the holiest cities, Osiris was venerated as Lord of the Dead. Pilgrims traveled from across the two lands to honor him, believing that burial near his shrine ensured a place in eternity. Each year, priests performed rituals reenacting his death and resurrection, carrying effigies through the streets, lamenting with Isis and Nephthys, then rejoicing in his renewal. Isis stood beside him as devoted wife and mistress of magic, and Horus as the living heir who secured the throne. Together, they embodied love, loyalty, and continuity, the divine family that promised rebirth after death. But Abydos was only one center among many. At Thebes, in Upper Egypt, another triad reigned supreme: Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. Amun, once a local wind god, rose to prominence as the hidden one, unseen yet all-pervading. With Mut, his consort, depicted as a lion-headed or vulture-crowned mother goddess, he formed a divine household. Their son Khonsu was the moon, youthful and radiant, who measured time and brought healing. Together they were celebrated in grand festivals, the most spectacular being the Opet festival, when Amun's statue was carried from Karnak to Luxor in a sacred bark, accompanied by music, incense, and offerings. For the people of Thebes, the triad symbolized divine kingship: Amun, the hidden power; Mut, the protective mother; Khonsu, the shining heir. At Memphis, the ancient capital, another triad shaped belief: Putta, Sekhmet, and Nefertum. Putta, the creator by word and thought, spoke the world into being. His consort Sekhmet was the lioness goddess of war and plague, fierce yet protective. Their son Nefertum, the youthful lotus god, embodied beauty, healing, and the dawn. In this family, creation, destruction, and renewal stood together, a balance of forces that explained both the gentleness and fury of existence. Worshippers sought Putta's wisdom, Sekhmet's protection, and Nefertum's healing, turning to them as a household of divine power. These triads reflected the Egyptian view that balance came through relationship. Just as Mat united opposites, so too did the divine family unite male and female, parent and child. No god stood alone, each was part of a household that mirrored the rhythm of human life, marriage, birth, protection, and succession. By venerating divine families, Egyptians reinforced their own social ideals, finding in the gods reflections of their own kinship bonds. Each region of Egypt had its own favored triad, binding local identity to divine worship. At Elephantine, Kern, Set, and Anaket ruled, linked to the source of the Nile's flood. At Dendera, Hathor, Horus, and I formed a joyful household of love and music. At Edfor, Horus stood with Hathor and their son Har-Sumtus, symbolizing protection and fertility. These local families allowed every city to claim a divine household as its own, weaving unity from diversity. The pharaoh's role was central in these cults. As Horus on earth, he stood as the living link between divine families and mortal households. In rituals, he performed offerings to the triads, ensuring that the bond between gods and humans remained unbroken. Temples were not places of communal worship, as in later religions, but homes of the gods, where priests served as attendants. The pharaoh was chief priest of all, though in practice his role was represented by the priesthood. The festivals of the triads were moments when gods and people met. During the Opet festival in Thebes, statues of Amun-Mut and Khonsu were carried through the city, veiled and sacred, yet their presence tangible. Crowds gathered, music rang, and the Nile glittered with boats. In these moments, divine families left their sanctuaries and walked among mortals, reaffirming the bond of protection and order. These sacred households also carried deeper symbolism. Osiris, Isis, and Horus embodied death, devotion, and renewal. Amun-Mut and Khonsu represented hidden power, motherhood, and time. Ptah, Sekhmet, and Nefertum were creation, destruction, and healing. Each triad was not random, but a reflection of balance, cosmic, social, and personal. By venerating them, Egyptians aligned themselves with the principles that sustained the universe. Even in the afterlife, the pattern endured. The deceased entered as Osiris, judged by Mat, protected by Isis, and renewed as Horus. Families buried together hoped to mirror divine households, believing that in eternity, as in life, kinship bound the soul. Picture the temples as they stood. At Karnak, colossal pylons tower, processional avenues lined with ram-headed sphinxes leading to Amun's sanctuary. Priests move in white linen, chanting hymns as incense curls upward. At Memphis, Ptah sits enthroned, serene, while Sekhmet stands fierce with lioness head, and Nefertum blooms with the lotus upon his brow. At Abydos, pilgrims chant Osiris's name, their voices blending with the wails of Isis and Nephthys in ritual lamentation. In every corner of Egypt, divine families breathe through stone and festival, anchoring gods to human life. Through these triads, Egyptians expressed the unity of opposites, the power of relationship, and the continuity of creation. Gods were not remote forces but kin, living in households that mirrored their own, and by venerating them, mortals ensured that their own families too would endure, in life, in death, and in eternity. Among the many goddesses who shaped Egyptian life, none was more beloved than Hathor. She was the Golden One, the goddess of music, love, and laughter, but also of motherhood, fertility, and the beauty of the sky itself. Her name meant House of Horus, for she was seen as his celestial mother, the great cow whose body formed the heavens, in which the sun and moon sailed as her children. To the Egyptians, Hathor's presence was everywhere. Joy was found. The sound of a sistrum rattling in worship, the beating of drums in festival, the laughter of dancers, the tenderness of lovers, all were hers. Women invoked her in childbirth, for she brought life gently into the world. Artists and musicians dedicated their craft to her, believing she inspired every note and brushstroke. Her temples resounded not with solemn silence, but with music, perfume, and celebration. Yet Hathor was not only joy, like all Egyptian deities. She carried duality within her. Beneath her golden beauty lay a fierce and terrifying force, the Eye of Rays, the destructive power unleashed when the sun god's authority was threatened. The myth of Hathor, as the Eye began when Rays grew weary of humanity. In his old age he heard mortals whisper against him, plotting rebellion. Anger filled his heart, and he sent his daughter the Eye to punish them. The Eye manifested as Hathor transformed into Sekhmet, the lioness. She descended upon mankind with fury, her claws sharp, her breath hot as desert wind. Villages burned, rivers ran red, and the earth shook with screams. None could resist her slaughter. Rays soon regretted his wrath, for Sekhmet's bloodlust knew no end. If she continued, no human would survive, and creation itself would falter. Desperate, Ray devised a plan. He ordered beer dyed red with ochre to resemble blood and poured it across the land. When Sekhmet came, ravenous for slaughter, she drank deeply. Her fury softened, her eyes dimmed, and she stumbled into slumber, transformed once again into Hathor, gentle and radiant. From this myth, Egyptians saw Hathor's dual face, loving mother and joyful dancer, yet also avenger, fierce as a lioness. She embodied the truth that love and fury were bound, that joy could turn to wrath, and that power required balance. Her temples reflected this duality. At Dendera, her great sanctuary, priests sang hymns to her as mistress of drunkenness, celebrating with music, dancing, and wine. Pilgrims came seeking love, fertility, and healing, offering mirrors, perfumes, and jewelry, symbols of beauty and desire. Yet in her shrines, lioness-headed statues reminded worshippers of her destructive might, a warning that devotion kept her favor sweet. Hathor also presided over transitions. She welcomed the dead into the afterlife, appearing as a cow emerging from the western mountain, her horns encircling the deceased. She gave mothers their children and received souls into paradise, a goddess who spanned both beginning and end. For this she was called Mistress of the West, guiding the departed toward Osiris's fields. In art, she was depicted in many forms, as a woman with a headdress of cow horns cradling the solar disk, as a cow whose body arched like the heavens, as a lioness when fierce, and as a sycamore tree, offering water and fruit to the weary dead. Her symbols were the sistrum, whose rattle banished evil, and the menet necklace, shaken in ritual to bring blessing and fertility. Hathor's influence stretched into daily life. Young women prayed to her for beauty and love, mothers for protection in childbirth, lovers for passion and harmony. Farmers invoked her for fertile fields, shepherds for thriving herds. She was not distant but near, approachable, and generous. In her, ordinary Egyptians found comfort, hope, and joy. Festivals in her honor were vibrant. At Dendera, processions carried her image to meet Horus of Edfu, her divine consort. Their union celebrated with music, feasting, and intoxication. These festivals symbolized renewal, fertility, and the joy of life's cycles. Unlike the solemn funerary rites of Osiris, Hathor's rituals burst with laughter and celebration, reminding the people that joy itself was sacred. Yet her role as Eye of Re ensured she was also a goddess of power. Pharaohs invoked her wrath against enemies, comparing their armies to mortals struck by her lioness form. In battle, her fury was protection; in peace, her tenderness was blessing. This duality made her one of the most complete deities of Egypt, nurturing yet dangerous, gentle yet fierce, beloved yet feared. Even outside Egypt, Hathor's influence spread. To the Sinai, she was Lady of Turquoise, protector of miners and travelers. In Nubia, she blended with local goddesses, extending her reach. In the Greco-Roman world, she was linked with Aphrodite and Venus, her image continuing to inspire love and beauty. Picture Hathor as the Egyptians did. The sun glows between her cow horns, casting golden light upon the land. Music swells, the sistrum rattles, voices sing in joy. Lovers embrace beneath her gaze, children laugh, farmers harvest in abundance. Yet in the distance, a lioness prowls, her eyes burning, ready to unleash destruction should Maat be threatened. Hathor embodies it all, beauty and terror, love and wrath, the fullness of life. For the Egyptians, she was the mirror of their own existence. Life was joy, music, family and love, but also danger, fury and death. Hathor did not separate these truths. She united them, reminding all who worshipped her that joy was precious because it could be lost, and love was fierce because it could turn to wrath. Thus she was adored above all as the Golden One, the Lady of Intoxication, the mother of Horus, the Eye of Re. Hathor was the sweetness of life itself, radiant and terrifying, ever watching, ever near. Hathor, golden and gentle, could transform when wrath consumed her. In that form, she became Sekhmet, the lioness, embodiment of the Eye of Re's fury. Where Hathor brought music and love, Sekhmet brought plague and flame. She was the hot desert wind, the burning sun at noon, the roar of battle, the terror of pestilence. To the Egyptians, she was both protector and destroyer, the goddess whose rage could save Egypt or annihilate it. Her name meant the powerful one. In art, she appeared as a woman with the head of a lioness, crowned with the solar disk and Ure's serpent. Her eyes blazed with fire, her breath seared the air, and her voice was the roar of storms. No enemy could withstand her glare. Pharaohs invoked her as the edge of their sword, the flame of their wrath, the terror that preceded their armies. To march with Sekhmet was to march with victory, but also with danger, for her rage could spill beyond enemy lines, consuming all in its path. The myth of her birth revealed her nature. When Res unleashed his eye against rebellious humanity, it was Sekhmet who descended, slaughtering mortals until rivers ran red. Drunk on blood, she could not be stopped until tricked with beer dyed red. Even then her nature was not erased, it merely slept within Hathor. From that day Egyptians understood that Sekhmet was necessary but perilous, a goddess who must be honored and appeased lest her fury awaken. Her domain was not only war, but plague. Epidemics were seen as arrows loosed by Sekhmet, invisible yet deadly. She was called Mistress of Dread and Lady of Pestilence, for her wrath manifested in sickness. Yet she was also great of healing, for the same goddess who sent disease could cure it. Her priests, known as the servants of Sekhmet, were physicians who blended ritual with medicine. They recited incantations, mixed herbs, and invoked her power to drive illness away. In this dual role, bringer of plague and source of healing, Sekhmet embodied the paradox of Egyptian divinity, destruction and restoration bound together. Pharaohs particularly revered Sekhmet, for she was both their weapon and their judge. Each king was expected to defend Egypt, to crush enemies, to expand order against chaos. In this role, he became the earthly channel of Sekhmet's fury. Hymns proclaimed Pharaoh as the raging lioness in battle, his enemies as prey beneath her claws. When armies marched, priests invoked her blessing, ensuring that her fire fell upon foreign lands. Yet in times of peace, Pharaoh had to appease her wrath, lest it turn inward and afflict his own people. Temples to Sekhmet dotted Egypt, often paired with sanctuaries of Pakta and Nefertum, forming the Memphis Triad. At Karnak, Amenhotep III commissioned hundreds of statues of Sekhmet, each carved with care, arrayed like an army of stone. These statues were not passive images, but vessels of power. Priests touched them in ritual, offering beer, incense, and hymns to cool her fury. Festivals honored her with music and intoxication, echoing the myth of her pacification. By delighting her with joy, they hoped to prevent her destructive side from awakening. The lioness goddess was also invoked in protective spells. Amulets bore her image, worn by those seeking strength and health. Mothers prayed to her for protection during childbirth, for while she could bring plague, she could also guard against danger. Her duality was constant, terror and salvation, wrath and mercy. To ignore her was perilous. To honor her was safety. Sekhmet's destructive power was not seen as evil, but as necessary. Just as floods could both nourish and drown, just as the sun gave life but also burned, Sekhmet embodied the fierce balance of nature. Chaos was always near, and only fury could drive it back. Her violence was not cruelty, but the raw force that kept creation intact. Without her, enemies would overwhelm Egypt. Demons of disease would run free. Apophis would swallow the sun. Her claws, though bloody, were shields of the cosmos. In rituals, priests sought to control her energy. They performed daily offerings, pouring beer and reciting chants to cool her temper. At New Year, when disease was thought to spread most fiercely, great ceremonies of pacification were held. Images of Sekhmet were appeased with music and drink, and priests worked tirelessly to ensure she turned her gaze toward Egypt's foes, not its people. Her presence in Egyptian imagination was vivid. To hear the roar of a lioness at night was to hear Sekhmet's voice. To feel the searing wind of the desert was to feel her breath. To fall ill suddenly was to suffer her arrows. Yet to recover from fever, to find health restored, was to know she had relented. Life and death alike were touched by her hand. Picture her as the Egyptians did, a lioness poised, eyes blazing, mane radiant with sunlight. In one paw she holds the ankh of life, in the other the scepter of power. Around her, flames dance, arrows streak through the air, and enemies scatter in terror. Yet at her side, physicians chant, mothers pray, and the sick whisper her name in hope. She is fury and salvation, a goddess who cannot be ignored, whose presence demands awe. Through Sekhmet, Egyptians confronted the truth that power is dangerous yet necessary, that destruction is the twin of creation, that fury can protect as well as destroy. She was not a goddess of comfort, but of reality, fierce, unyielding, and eternal. Where Sekhmet's fury blazed like fire, another power guided Egypt with calm precision. Thoth, lord of wisdom, writing, and divine order. If Sekhmet embodied raw strength, Thoth embodied intellect, the pen that steadied the sword, the word that bound chaos, the calculation that measured the heavens. He was depicted as a man with the head of an ibis, long curved beak, pointed like a reed pen, or as a baboon sacred to him. In either form he carried the scribe's palette, the lunar crescent, and the tools of writing. His symbols reflected his essence, light in darkness, clarity in confusion, balance in turmoil. Egyptians called him Dujuti, he who is like the ibis. Thoth's role was vast. He was the inventor of writing, the measure of time, the recorder of judgment, and the mediator in divine disputes. He was said to have given humans language, hieroglyphs, mathematics, and astronomy. Every scroll in a temple, every carved inscription, every tally of grain owed its existence to him. Without Thoth, knowledge would vanish, memory would falter, and the gods themselves would lack record of their deeds. His presence was most crucial in the Hall of Judgment. When Osiris weighed the hearts of the dead against Maat's feather, Thoth stood nearby, palette in hand to record the result. He did not sway the scales, he ensured their accuracy. No soul could protest his writing, for his words were truth itself. In this role he was not executioner, nor judge but clerk of eternity, the divine scribe whose ink shaped destiny. But Thoth was more than recorder, he was mediator. When Isis and Horus battled Set for the throne, it was Thoth who soothed tempers, who healed Horus's wounded eye, who calmed Ra's anger. In countless disputes, he stood as peacemaker, speaking reason, when wrath threatened to consume. He embodied diplomacy, proof that intellect could restrain violence. The myths credited him with shaping time itself. When Ra forbade Nut from giving birth on any day of the year, it was Thoth who devised the trick to outwit him. By gambling with Khonsu, the moon, he won slivers of light to create 5 extra days outside the calendar's 360. On these hidden days, Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys and Horus the Elder were born. Thus time itself bent to Thoth's cunning. Without him, the divine family would never have entered the world. As Lord of the Moon, Thoth measured cycles, days, months, years. He kept the heavens in order, ensuring the stars rose and set, the months flowed, the Nile's flood was marked. Farmers trusted his calculations, priests timed rituals by his reckoning, and kings relied on his records. To master time was to master life, and Thoth held that mastery. His wisdom was also magical. He was patron of Heka, for writing itself was spellcraft. To inscribe a name was to summon its power. To recite a formula was to bind reality. Priests memorized his hymns, magicians invoked his name in spells, and scribes saw themselves as his earthly counterparts. Every library of scrolls was his temple, every ink-stained reed pen his tool. At Hermopolis, his chief cult center, he was honored as creator. There he was said to have spoken the world into being, uttering the first words that shaped Nun's chaos into form. Sound itself was sacred in his myth, for with voice and writing, he made existence knowable. He also guided Ra's nightly voyage through the duet, while Set fought Apophis with spear, Thoth armed the crew with spells. He spoke incantations that bound serpents, healed wounds, and steadied the bark when storms shook its hull. Without him, brute force would falter, for chaos could not be slain by muscle alone. It required knowledge, names, and words of power for mortals. Thoth was guardian of scribes, students in a house of life, temple schools, where texts were copied and preserved, prayed to him for skill. Every line of hieroglyphs carved into tombs, every spell written in the Book of the Dead, every record of grain or law, began with homage to Thoth. He made memory possible, and through memory, immortality. Yet his wisdom was not cold but balanced. Thoth was often called the Lord of Maat, for he ensured balance, not only in courts, but in the cosmos. He stood beside Maat herself, reinforcing truth, weighing contradictions, harmonizing opposites. He was neither partisan nor vengeful, but impartial, the voice of balance, in a world of extremes. Picture him as the Egyptians did, an ibis-headed god, feathers gleaming in moonlight, bent over a scroll, reed pen poised. His eyes reflect the stars he measures, his hand steady as he inscribes eternity. Behind him, the moon arcs across the sky, marking time. Around him gather gods in dispute, their voices loud, but his words calm them, binding chaos into order. To the Egyptians, Thoth was indispensable. Without him, there could be no language, no record, no law, no healing, no measure of time. He was the invisible thread that held the cosmos in balance, not through force but through knowledge. In him they saw the truth, that wisdom was as vital as strength, that words were as powerful as weapons, and that time itself bowed to intellect. Thus he was honored not with blood or fear, but with ink, prayer, and memory. Every stroke of the scribe's pen was an offering, every scroll copied a hymn, every calculation a ritual. Through Thoth, Egypt learned, remembered, and endured. Thoth's pen could only record fairly, because it was guided by a principle older than ink or word. Maat, she was not only a goddess, but the very law of existence, truth embodied, balance made visible. Her feather weighed every heart, her presence steadied every throne, her absence meant collapse. To Egyptians, she was as essential as air or Nile water, for without her the world unraveled into chaos. Maat was depicted simply yet powerfully, a woman with an ostrich feather upon her head, or sometimes only the feather itself. Unlike Sekhmet's claws or Hathor's horns, her symbol was delicate, yet it outweighed empires. The feather did not crush. It measured, it did not wound, it revealed in her Truth was not thunderous, but quiet, absolute, and eternal. When Atom rose from none and spoke the first gods into being, he established Mat to give shape to chaos. Without her, earth and sky could not be separated, seasons would not turn, Ro's sun would not rise. She was the framework upon which creation rested, the rhythm that made time possible, the balance that kept waters from drowning fields, and deserts from swallowing the valley. Every god upheld Mat. Ro sailed the sky each day because of her order. Thoth's calculations followed her law. Osiris judged by her measure. Even fierce Set, destructive though he was, played his role within her framework. His violence turned against Apophis, so that the balance endured. Gods did not rule above Mat. They ruled within her. She was the law to which even they were bound. For humans, Mat was both moral and practical. She governed how one treated family, neighbor, and stranger. To act in Mat was to tell truth, deal fairly, show kindness, honor the gods, and respect the land. To reject Mat was to lie, cheat, steal, exploit, or neglect. The negative confession, recited before Osiris, was a declaration of living in Mat. I have not killed unjustly. I have not withheld bread. I have not polluted water. Each denial was not only personal defense, but affirmation of her law. Mat also bound rulers. Pharaoh was called beloved of Mat, for his duty was to uphold her across the two lands. His rituals, laws, and wars were judged by whether they maintained balance. To build temples was to honor Mat. To feed the hungry was to enact her. To crush rebellion, or repel invaders, was to defend her. Kingship was not mere authority, but responsibility to sustain harmony. A pharaoh who failed in this duty invited famine, disorder, and invasion, for without Mat, the gods withdrew their favor. Courtrooms reflected her presence. Judges wore small effigies of Mat, or her feather, signifying that they spoke not for themselves, but for truth. Their verdicts were not meant to be arbitrary, but aligned with cosmic balance. Even the poorest Egyptian, standing before a magistrate, knew that justice was grounded not in human whim, but in divine principle. In temples, offerings to gods often included a tiny figure of Mat or a carved feather. This symbolized that worship itself was meaningless without truth. To lie in devotion, to offer without sincerity, was empty. Only when Mat accompanied the gift was it accepted. Priests recited her name, pharaohs raised her image, and even the gods delighted in receiving her as offering, for she was the highest gift, order itself. Her role in the afterlife was most iconic. In the Hall of Judgment, Anubis placed the heart on the scales, and on the opposite side rested Mat's feather. No wealth, prayer, or bribe could alter the outcome. The heart was the record of a life, and the feather the eternal standard. If they balanced, the soul was justified, welcomed into Osiris's paradise. If the heart weighed heavy with falsehood and cruelty, Amit devoured it, and the soul ceased to exist. The Egyptians therefore lived with Mat as daily compass. Farmers measured fairness in sharing water channels by her law. Merchants weighed goods honestly in her name. Families treated one another kindly, knowing the feather would one day test their hearts. To live in Mat was to ensure not only peace in life, but survival in eternity. Mat also held cosmic meaning beyond morality. She was the reason why stars followed their paths, why floods came in season, why the Nile receded to reveal fertile soil. When natural disasters struck, floods too high, drought too long, storms too fierce, Egyptians feared Mat had been disturbed. Rituals, prayers, and offerings sought to restore her, to steady the balance again. Picture her as they did, a graceful woman, with a single feather rising from her brow. She sits in silence, serene, yet her presence steadies gods and men alike. Around her, disputes quiet, scales, balance, laws hold. She does not roar or strike, yet all bow before her, for her power is truth, and truth is inexorable. In every myth, Mat was the background force that held stories together. Horus could triumph, because his claim was aligned with her. Isis could restore Osiris, because her devotion upheld her. Thoth could write and mediate, because he followed her. Even Ra, blazing sun, rose and set by her rhythm. She was less a character than the stage itself, less a goddess than existence personified. For the Egyptians this was wisdom. Strength falters, wealth fades, beauty dies, but Maat endures. To live within her was to align with eternity, to defy her was to vanish into chaos. Thus, when Egyptians carved prayers into tomb walls, they often ended with a single phrase, "I have lived in Maat." It was both confession and hope, that when their hearts were weighed, the feather would not tremble, and they would walk into the field of reeds with joy. Matter was the measure of every heart, but the one who placed that heart on the scales, who safeguarded the dead until judgment, was Anubis, jackal-headed and solemn. He was the shadow who walked beside every coffin, the unseen presence at every burial, the god who ensured death was not abandonment, but passage. Anubis's origins lay deep in Egypt's earliest myths, before Osiris rose as king of the dead. In those older tales, Anubis himself ruled the underworld, guiding souls through shadow. Only later, when Osiris took that throne, did Anubis step aside, not as rival but as loyal son and guardian. In some traditions, he was the child of Nephthys and Osiris, conceived in secrecy and raised by Isis. Others claimed he was born of Ra himself, or of Set and Nephthys. These variations did not diminish him, but revealed his fluid role, always close to the boundary of life and death, always the protector of the vulnerable. His animal form reflected his nature. Jackals prowled the desert edges, often near cemeteries, where graves were shallow and corpses vulnerable. To Egyptians, this was no desecration, but divine guardianship. The jackal's keen senses, its silent tread, its nocturnal gaze, made it the perfect symbol of a god who watched over tombs. By worshipping Anubis, Egyptians believed they transformed scavenger into sentinel, no longer a threat to the dead, but their eternal guardian. Anubis's greatest gift was the invention of mummification. When Osiris was slain and scattered, it was Anubis who gathered his body, wrapped him in linen, anointed him with oils, and preserved him for eternity. From that act, embalming became sacred art, every priest who performed it wearing the mask of the jackal to embody him. The careful removal of organs, the drying with natron, the wrapping in layers, all were done in his name. To preserve the body was to follow Anubis's example, ensuring that the Ka and Bay could return to it in the afterlife. In tomb paintings, Anubis is shown bending over the corpse, hands steady, gaze solemn. He is not depicted with sorrow or joy, but with calm professional care. Death was certain, but decay could be prevented, and Anubis's hands were steady enough to bridge that gap. Beyond embalming, Anubis stood as protector of tombs. Cemeteries were sacred places, but they were also vulnerable to thieves, to animals, to sandstorms. Egyptians feared that disturbance of the body might endanger the soul. Prayers were carved into tomb walls, calling on Anubis to repel intruders, to turn jackals away, to strike thieves blind. His presence was invoked in curses. Whosoever disturbs this grave, may Anubis tear out his heart. Fear of his wrath guarded countless tombs, more effectively than soldiers could. Yet Anubis was not only fearsome, he was guide. The Greeks later called him Psychopompos, the conductor of souls. To Egyptians, he was the one who took the hand of the newly dead, leading them through the Duat's dangers. He walked them past serpents, lakes of fire, and monstrous guardians, ensuring they reached Osiris's hall intact. Without Anubis, a soul might wander lost forever. With him, even the poorest peasant had a protector as powerful as Pharaoh. In the weighing of the heart, it was Anubis who placed the heart on the scales, his long fingers steady, his jackal eyes unblinking. He did not judge, that was Osiris's role, nor record, that was Thoth's task. But without his impartial hand, the trial could not begin. Egyptians trusted him to be fair, for jackals do not lie. They see what is hidden, smell what is concealed. His role was not to condemn or pardon, but to reveal. Devotion to Anubis was deeply personal. Unlike Red, distant in the heavens, or Osiris, enthroned in eternity, Anubis was near. Every death, every funeral, every grave called him. Families prayed to him to protect loved ones, to guide their spirits, to watch over their tombs. Amulets shaped like jackals were buried with the dead. Images of Anubis painted on sarcophagi, prayers whispered into linen wrappings. His cult spread widely. At Cenopolis, the city of the dog, he was honored above all. Jackals raised in sanctuaries as living symbols of his power. Pilgrims brought offerings of bread, beer, and oil, asking him to extend his protection. To invoke Anubis was to acknowledge death without fear, to trust that passing into shadow did not mean abandonment. Anubis was also invoked in magic. Spells called on him to protect against nightmares, to heal sickness, to guard children. His name was etched on charms, his image stamped on seals. Even the living turned to him, for his guardianship extended beyond death into danger, illness, and fear. Picture him as Egyptians did. A man in sleek black linen, his head the jackal's, ears pricked, eyes sharp. In one hand he carries the flail, in the other the ankh. He bends over a corpse, wrapping linen with precision, whispering words that preserve flesh against decay. In another vision, he walks beside a soul through the duat, silent yet steady, his hand firm as shadows press close. Around him, serpents hiss, fires roar, but none dare approach the one guarded by the jackal god. To Egyptians, Anubis was both solemn and intimate. He was not the ruler of death, but its companion. He did not demand fear, but offered reassurance that the body would be safe, the tomb intact, the soul guided, the judgment fair. He was the god of transition, not finality. In his presence, death was not chaos, but ritual, not loss, but passage. Anubis reminded Egyptians that dying was part of Ma'at, a step within balance, not its end. With him at the threshold, they could face eternity unafraid. Anubis guided the dead through the duat, steady and loyal. Yet even he could not banish the greatest terror of the night, the endless coils of Apophis, the chaos serpent, the enemy of Rad, the devourer of order. To Egyptians, Apophis was not simply a monster, but the embodiment of uncreation itself, the yawning abyss of Nun rising again to swallow what the gods had made. Depicted as a colossal serpent, Apophis's body stretched across the horizon, his scales impenetrable, his eyes burning with malevolence. In some depictions he was bound with chains, hacked by knives, pierced by spears, yet always whole again, for chaos could never be slain. In others he loomed so vast that his coils encircled Ra's entire bark, threatening to squeeze the sun into nothingness. His very name, Apep, meant the opposer. Every night, as Ra descended into the duat, Apophis awaited him. At first, the river of the underworld flowed calm, the bark gliding steady. Then shadows thickened, waters grew turbulent, and from the depths rose the serpent. His jaws gaped wide enough to engulf gods. His hiss echoed like thunder. His eyes hypnotized crew and deity alike. Spells recorded in the books of the underworld describe how his gaze froze oarsmen, his roar silenced hymns, his coils turned water into walls. It was here that Set, once usurper, found redemption. Spear in hand, he stood at the prow, striking Apophis with force. Other gods joined in. Isis wove spells, Serket stung with venom, Neith shot arrows, and Thoth recited incantations binding the serpent's body. Yet still Apophis returned, each night as strong as before. Victory was never final, only repeated. This eternal struggle reflected Egyptian truth. Chaos could not be destroyed, only resisted. Just as floods threatened fields, deserts encroached, and storms shattered harvests, Apophis's coils forever threatened the sun. The duty of gods, pharaohs, and people alike was to repel him daily, to uphold Ma'at against his return. Temples across Egypt joined this cosmic battle. Priests recited spells from the Book of Apophis, burning wax effigies of the serpent, stabbing them with knives, trampling them beneath feet. they spat upon his name, tore his images, cursed his power. These rituals were not symbolic, they were warfare. Each dawn depended on their success, each sunrise proof that their magic had aided Rad. Even ordinary Egyptians could take part. Amulets inscribed with coils and knives invoked protection. Prayers at dawn thanked the gods for overcoming the serpent, acknowledging that every morning was a victory. The cycle of night and day was not taken for granted, but seen as the triumph of order over chaos, of Mart over Apophis. Unlike other gods, Apophis had no temple, no priesthood, no cult. He was never worshipped, only hated. Yet his role was essential. Without him, there could be no struggle, and without struggle, no renewal. By opposing Red, he defined Re's triumph. By threatening Mart, he revealed its necessity. Apophis was the shadow that made light visible, the chaos that sharpened order. Some myths portrayed him as born from Re's own spit, a shadow cast from the sun god's body, suggesting that chaos was inseparable from creation. Others claimed he was older than the gods, a remnant of Nun itself, rising each night to reclaim what had been lost. These variations all circled the same truth. Apophis was eternal, a force that could never be erased. In art, he appears pierced by spears, bound with ropes, sliced into pieces, yet his eyes always glare, his mouth always gapes, his coils always threaten. He is shown lying beneath Round's bark, pressed down by knives, yet always present. His defeat is constant, his return inevitable. For Egyptians, this was not despair, but understanding. Life was fragile, always contested. Floods could fail, droughts could starve, disease could strike, but with ritual, devotion, and Mat, survival was possible. Apophis reminded them that vigilance was eternal, that chaos always lurked, but that order could endure with effort. Picture the nightly scene. The golden bark glides across black waters, crewed by gods. The silence deepens, and from the depths rises a serpent, vast as mountains, scales glittering, eyes glowing with hatred. His body coils around the vessel, hissing thunder, jaws opening to swallow the sun. Set raises his spear, Isis chants spells, Thoth's voice recites binding words. Knives plunge, ropes tighten, venom strikes, and Apophis rides. The bark trembles but sails on. At last dawn breaks, light floods the sky, and the serpent sinks, defeated, but never destroyed. To wake at sunrise was to know this victory had been won again. To see Round's disk rise above the horizon was to believe that Mat had triumphed, that chaos had been beaten back one more time. Life continued, not because chaos was gone, but because it had been resisted. Thus Apophis, hated yet eternal, became one of the most profound symbols in Egyptian thought. He was not worshipped, not honored, not beloved, yet without him, there would be no dawn, no struggle, no meaning. His coils defined the limits of order, his attacks made Round's light precious. The Egyptians understood that existence was never safe, never absolute, but always fragile, always renewed through vigilance. Apophis was the reminder, the shadow, the eternal enemy, whose defeat gave life its rhythm. Apophis showed the Egyptians that chaos was eternal, always pressing against order. But to resist chaos, the gods had to stand together. At the heart of Egypt's theology was the Ennead of Heliopolis, a council of 9 deities whose stories wove the fabric of the cosmos. From Atum's first act of creation to the drama of Osiris and Set, their lineage defined both divine hierarchy and the rhythm of life. The Ennead began with Atum, the self-created one, who rose from Nun's waters on the first mound of earth. In solitude he brought forth Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture. Shu lifted the heavens, Tefnut moistened the earth, and space was formed. Their union produced Geb, the fertile earth, and Nut, the arched sky. It was their embrace, pried apart by Shu, that gave room for creation. From Geb and Nut were born the 4 siblings whose tales shaped Egypt's mythology: Osiris, lord of life, and afterlife; Isis, mistress of magic and motherhood, Set, god of desert and storm, and Nephthys, guardian of the margins, mistress of lament. Together with their parents and grandparents, they completed the nine. This family was not harmonious. Their quarrels, loves, betrayals, and triumphs embodied the contradictions of existence. Yet their unity as Ennead represented the structure of the cosmos itself: air, moisture, earth, sky, life, magic, chaos, mourning, and creation bound together in balance. At Heliopolis, the great sun city, priests honored the Ennead as divine council. Each god had a temple, yet all were linked, their myths forming a continuous saga. Hymns invoked them as guardians of Mat, arbiters of disputes, sustainers of creation. Together they were called Pesajet, the Nine. Though Egypt knew countless gods, the Ennead stood as its highest pantheon. Atum was revered as patriarch. In temple hymns, he was praised as the one who brought order from Nun, father of gods, eternal source. Yet he was distant, more principle than presence. His children carried his work forward. Shu, ever lifting the sky, was stability. Tefnut, moist and fertile, was blessing. Geb, green and solid, bore crops and rivers. Nut, jeweled with stars, swallowed the sun at dusk and birthed it at dawn. They embodied the physical world itself, but it was the younger four, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, who captured Egyptian imagination most. Their myth was the heart of the Ennead's drama. Osiris, king of Egypt, brought order and fertility. Set, jealous, slew him, scattering his body. Isis, loyal and cunning, restored him with magic, conceiving Horus, who later avenged his father and took the throne. Nephthys mourned, a figure of grief and devotion. In this tale, death, magic, vengeance, and renewal intertwined, reflecting the eternal cycle of Egypt's land and people. The Ennead's significance was not just mythic, but cosmic. Egyptians believed their quarrels explained the tensions of nature. The fertile Nile Valley, Osiris always threatened by desert storms. Set, the love between earth and sky. Geb and Nut, forever parted by air. Shu, the necessity of lament. Nephthys for renewal. The Ennead embodied contradictions, reconciled by balance, each god necessary, though often in conflict. In the divine tribunal, the Ennead often acted as judges. When Horus and Set contended for Egypt's throne, it was before the Ennead that arguments were made. When Ra grew weary, he turned to the Nine for counsel. They were not merely family but court, reflecting the councils of pharaohs on earth. Just as Egypt's king ruled with viziers and judges, so too did the cosmos function through assembly. Temples to the Ennead were filled with hymns praising their unity. Priests recited litanies, naming all nine, invoking them together. Rituals honored Atum at dawn, Shu and Tefnut at midday, Geb and Nut at dusk, and Osiris's family at night, completing the cycle of day and night. In this way, worship mirrored the rhythm of the cosmos. The Ennead also inspired other pantheons. In Thebes, the triad of Ammon, Mut, and Khonsu reflected a similar structure. In Memphis, Ptah, Sekhmet, and Nefertum formed another family. But the Ennead of Heliopolis was the oldest, the archetype from which others flowed. Its myths explained why the world existed, why order was fragile, and why kingship was divine. For pharaohs, the Ennead's story was central. Each king declared himself Horus, heir of Osiris, upholder of Mat. In ritual, he presented Mat herself to the gods, showing his role as guarantor of balance. He ruled not in isolation, but as the living link to the Ennead, their struggles and victories embodied in his reign. Picture the Ennead as the Egyptians did, 9 figures arrayed in council. Atum presides, ancient and radiant. Shu holds Nut aloft, while Geb lies beneath, green and fertile. Isis stands tall, wisdom in her gaze, while Nephthys weeps softly, her voice lamenting. Osiris sits dignified, crook and flail across his chest, while Set looms with restless energy, eyes sharp with defiance. Together they are family, yet also cosmos itself, bound in fragile harmony. To Egyptians, the Ennead was more than myth, it was the structure of reality. Their stories explained the Nile's fertility and the desert's storms, the need for mourning and the hope of renewal, the balance of earth and sky. Every contradiction of life was reflected in their drama. The nine were not worshipped as isolated deities, but as a living system. To honor Osiris was to honor renewal, to pray to Isis was to invoke magic, to fear Set was to acknowledge chaos, to mourn with Nephthys was to accept grief. All were needed, none could be excluded. Together they formed the web of existence. Thus the Ennead endured as Egypt's great pantheon, its myths retold in temples, its names inscribed in tombs, its lessons guiding pharaohs and peasants alike. Through them, Egyptians understood that life was family, that balance came from relationship, and that even gods quarreled, but through balance, order prevailed. The Ennead shaped the cosmos, but even the greatest gods did not hold complete freedom. Beneath their dramas ran another current, destiny. To Egyptians, life was not entirely one's own. At birth, a soul was bound to a fate decreed by forces beyond choice. This power was embodied in Shai, the personification of fate, and the mysterious seven Hathors, goddesses, who appeared at birth to speak what was to come. Shai was a shadowy figure, rarely depicted in art, yet his presence was undeniable. He was the allotter of years, the one who inscribed the span of life. Sometimes he appeared as a man bearing a scroll, sometimes as a serpent coiled with inevitability. In hymns, he was addressed as the one who is present at birth, who fixes destiny, who decrees the length of days. Pharaohs themselves acknowledged his power, declaring that their reign was as long as Shai permitted. Alongside him stood the seven Hathors, forms of the great goddess of love and joy, but in this role, bearers of truth. At each birth, they gathered, whispering the child's destiny. Would the child live long or die young? Would love flourish or falter? Would greatness or obscurity mark their path? Their words were not guesses but certainties, woven into the very fabric of existence. In tales the seven Hathors appeared veiled, their voices solemn, their words irreversible. They did not shape destiny, they revealed it. Once spoken, no force, not even Rheros or Osiris, could alter what they declared. To Egyptians, this was both comfort and dread. Comfort, for one's fate was set, secure, not random; dread, for it could not be changed. Myths told of children born with ominous prophecies. One story spoke of a prince destined to die by crocodile, snake, or dog. His father, fearful, built a palace in isolation, surrounding him with luxury yet barring him from danger. But destiny found him nonetheless. A snake crept into the palace, only to be slain. Later, he befriended a dog, only for it to turn on him. Finally, he met his fate in the jaws of a crocodile. The tale reminded listeners that Shai's decree could not be avoided. Attempts to flee destiny only led one into its arms. Yet fate was not viewed as cruel. Shai was not enemy, but balance. Life had its span, and death was certainty. To know this was to live wisely, to cherish joy, to act with mind, for one's days were numbered. Destiny gave weight to every action, meaning to every choice. Egyptians did not despair before Shai. They accepted him as part of cosmic truth. The seven Hathors also bore a gentler side. As aspects of Hathors, they linked destiny to joy, music, and love. They were invoked in marriage rituals, in childbirth, in prayers for protection. Their prophecies might be harsh, but their presence was protective, their bond maternal. Families placed figurines of the seven Hathors in homes, calling upon them to watch over children. Pharaohs, though exalted, were not exempt. In inscriptions, kings declared that their reign was long, according to the decree of Shai. Even divine rule bowed to destiny. Yet pharaohs also invoked Heka, magic, to strengthen their allotted span, offering to Shai in temples to secure favor. Though fate could not be erased, perhaps its edge could be softened through devotion. For ordinary Egyptians, Shai and the seven Hathors explained life's unpredictability. Why one child thrived while another perished. Why one farmer's crops flourished while his neighbors failed. Why love blossomed or withered. These were the workings of fate. Accepting destiny allowed them to endure hardship with resilience, trusting that suffering was not random but part of a larger order. Shai also appeared in the afterlife. In funerary texts, he was depicted standing beside Osiris, recording the outcome of the scales. Not only life, but death was in his hands, for he decreed not just years but the soul's path. This reinforced his inevitability, from cradle to grave. Shai was present. Picture the scene at a birth as Egyptians imagined it. A child cries for the first time, and around the bed appear 7 women, veiled, luminous, their voices soft but weighty. They bend over the infant, whispering what lies ahead, whether long life or short, whether joy or sorrow. Behind them stands a figure with scroll and pen, Shai himself inscribing years upon parchment. The parents weep or rejoice, powerless yet grateful, for destiny is revealed, and the child's path is set. Egyptians responded not with rebellion, but with devotion. They prayed for Shai's favor, honored the Hathors, and lived according to Maat, so that whatever fate befell them, they met it rightly. To them, destiny was not chains, but certainty, the assurance that existence was ordered, not random. Even suffering had place. Even death had reason. In this way, Shai and the 7 Hathors were less feared than respected. They reminded Egyptians that life was gift, fragile and finite. Every sunrise, every harvest, every embrace was precious because it was bounded. Fate was not cruelty but frame, giving shape to joy and meaning to sorrow. Thus, destiny, though inescapable, was not despair but wisdom. To live fully was to live within Shai's decree, guided by Maat, sustained by devotion, until the heart was weighed, and the soul passed into Osiris's fields. Shai and the 7 Hathors revealed destiny, but destiny itself unfolded within a deeper framework. To the Egyptians, time was not a straight line with beginning and end, but 2 interwoven forms, cycles that returned endlessly, and permanence that endured forever. These twin aspects were called Nia and Djet, and together they shaped how Egyptians understood life, death, and eternity. Nia was the time of renewal, of repetition, of return. It was the cycle of the sun rising each dawn, the Nile flooding each year, the seasons turning, crops sprouting and dying and sprouting again. It was movement, change, and recurrence. Re embodied Nia as he sailed the sky by day and the underworld by night, reborn endlessly. Festivals marked this rhythm: Opet in Thebes, the annual Osiris mysteries at Abydos, the harvest rites. Each ritual was not mere commemoration, but reenactment, making the cycle real again, binding human life to the eternal rhythm of the gods. Djet, by contrast, was permanence, the unchanging eternity beyond time's cycles. Osiris embodied Djet as lord of the underworld, reigning not in motion but in stillness. Where Rhea renewed himself daily, Osiris endured forever, unaltered, a constant presence. Tombs, pyramids, and stone temples were built in the image of Djet, lasting, unmoving, eternal. In hieroglyphs, Djet was written with the symbol of a serpent, coiled and resting, while Nia was a sun disk rising, movement embodied. Together they formed eternity in its fullness, change and permanence, motion and stillness. Life unfolded between these two. Each day, Egyptians lived within Nia, plowing, harvesting, celebrating festivals, watching the sun rise and set. But their ultimate goal was Djet, the still eternity of the blessed dead, where one reigned beside Osiris, unchanged, unaging, whole. By living rightly in the cycles, they prepared for permanence. Kingship embodied this duality. The pharaoh was both living Horus, ruling in the cycles of Nia, and dead Osiris, eternal in Djet. His coronation marked renewal, his death permanence. In rituals he offered Maat to the gods daily, ensuring that cycles continued, yet he also built pyramids and temples of stone to anchor his reign in eternity. His names reflected both aspects, one tied to the living cycle, the other to eternal order. Thus kingship was time itself made flesh, guaranteeing that renewal and permanence remained balanced. Ritual was another bridge between Nia and Djet. Each morning, priests entered temples, washed statues, dressed them, offered food, and sang hymns. These were not symbolic gestures. They reenacted the first dawn of creation, renewing it daily. Without these acts, Egyptians feared the cycles might falter, the sun might fail to rise. Yet at the same time, temples themselves stood immovable, embodiments of eternity. Within them, the cycles of daily ritual secured permanence. For the dead, time's duality shaped the afterlife. The journey through the duat was near, a cycle of rebirth, following Re's bark through night to dawn. But once the heart was weighed and justified, the soul entered Djet, the eternal field of reeds, unchanging paradise. In funerary texts, the deceased prays, "May I be given near as Re, and Djet as Osiris." Both were desired, for only together was eternity complete. The Egyptians also saw time reflected in natural rhythms. The Nile's flood, called the inundation, was annual proof of Nehe, destruction and renewal bound together. Fields washed bare, only to bloom again. Yet the monuments along its banks, pyramids, temples, tombs, stood as Djet, imperishable against the flood. Even their landscape embodied both aspects, river flowing in cycles, stone standing eternal. Unlike later cultures that feared the end of time, Egyptians believed it was endless. The sun would always rise, the Nile always flood, the dead always enter the fields. Because Mast upheld the balance, even Apophis, eternal foe, was not doom but cycle. His defeat repeated nightly, his threat constant but never final. Time was not fragile, line but enduring rhythm. This view shaped their art and architecture. Reliefs depicted pharaohs offering Mart to gods forever, not as a single event but as timeless act. Tomb paintings showed banquets, hunts and harvests, not because they happened once, but because they were eternal. Writing itself was a form of Djet, fixing words in permanence, while performance of ritual recited them anew in Nehe. In this way, every act became eternal by being repeated. Picture the Egyptian sense of time. Dawn breaks, Ra's sun emerges from Nut's body, beginning the day. Workers plow the fields, the Nile waters receding, crops sprouting green. Priests chant hymns, reenacting creation, making it real again. Evening falls, the sun sets, Ras enters the Dua, Apophis rises, the gods battle. At last, dawn returns, the cycle continues. Yet within this cycle, pyramids loom unmoved, Osiris reigns unchanged, the dead dwell eternally. Time flows, yet time stands still. This vision gave Egyptians resilience. Drought, invasion, or famine were not the end, for cycles returned. Even death was not final, for eternity awaited. Their faith was not in escape from time, but in its endurance. Nehe and Djet ensured that life had rhythm, death had meaning, and eternity had place. Thus, while Shai set destiny and Hathor's revealed fate, it was time itself, endless and eternal, that carried every soul. Egyptians lived within its cycles, died into its permanence, and trusted that Ras and Osiris, Nehe and Djet, would endure forever. The journey through Egypt's myths has led from the first mound rising from Nun to the endless cycles of time. Gods were born, loved, fought, and died. Humans prayed, built, feared, and hoped.
City!
Pined. Yet all of it, creation, kingship, judgment, and fate, rested upon one truth. Existence was fragile, held together only by balance. The Egyptians knew that Maat was not permanent by default. It had to be renewed each day, upheld in ritual, in justice, in the rhythm of the sun and Nile. And in this renewal, they found eternity. At the heart of this vision stood their gods. Rebel blazing sun carried light across the sky and braved Apophis each night. Osiris reigned in stillness, promising rebirth beyond death. Isis wove spells, protector and mother, while Set raged yet defended the bark when needed. Hathor laughed in joy, Sekhmet roared in fury, Thoth calculated, Mat weighed, and Anubis guarded. Each had their place, each necessary, each embodying forces. Egyptians saw around them daily, but the divine was never distant. Unlike later faiths where gods dwelled apart, the Egyptian deities lived within every moment. The flood of the Nile was Osiris rising, the desert wind was Set's breath, the dawn was Nut giving birth, the judgment hall was not myth, but certainty awaiting every soul. To Egyptians, the gods were woven into existence itself, inseparable from the rhythms of nature and the duties of humanity. Pharaohs carried this vision into rule. Each king was Horus in life, Osiris in death, chosen to uphold Mat. Coronations, renewed creation, temples maintained cosmic order. Wars were fought not for conquest alone, but to extend balance against chaos. The king was not just political ruler, but pivot of existence, his daily offerings, ensuring the sun rose and Nile flooded. Even his failures were cosmic. When famine struck, it was said, Pharaoh had faltered in upholding Mat. Yet ordinary Egyptians shared this responsibility. Every farmer drawing water, every artisan carving stone, every mother whispering charms, lived within Mat. They upheld it in honesty, kindness, devotion, and respect for gods and kin. To live justly was to contribute to cosmic stability, to tip scales toward balance. In this, every life mattered, not only pharaohs, but peasants, craftsmen, and childs. Destiny, revealed by Shai and the 7 Hathors, set boundaries, the length of years, the arc of fortune. Yet within those bounds, choice remained. Egyptians believed one could not escape death, but one could meet it with truth. To live in Mat ensured the heart would balance, the soul justified, eternity secured. Thus fate was not tyranny, but frame, within which life had meaning. Time itself, as Nehi and Djedjet, enfolded all. Days and seasons cycled endlessly, yet eternity endured unchanged. Egyptians embraced both. They lived in cycles of harvest, festival, sunrise, and sunset, but hoped for still eternity beside Osiris. Their tombs were stone embodiments of Djedjet, their rituals reenactments of Nehi. Together they formed wholeness, life repeating, death enduring, eternity complete. The myths were not idle stories, but guides. Osiris's death and rebirth taught that life sprang from loss, fertility from decay, hope from mourning. Isis' cunning revealed that wisdom and devotion conquered even death. Horus's struggle against Set showed that justice was hard-won but inevitable. Re's nightly voyage reminded all that chaos pressed always, but vigilance could hold it back. Through myth, Egyptians explained their world and learned how to live within it. For them, death was not feared as annihilation, but understood as transformation. To be embalmed was to follow Osiris's path. To be judged was to face Makhet's feather. To be justified was to enter the field of reeds, where family reunited, crops never failed, and joy endured. Eternity was not distant heaven, but perfected Egypt, familiar and eternal. Even their monuments echoed this vision. Pyramids rose like primordial mounds from Nun, tombs were carved with spells to guide souls, temples aligned with solstices, statues animated with Heka, stone and word made eternity tangible. These works were not mere architecture, but cosmic anchors, binding human effort to divine balance. And so, thousands of years later, their legacy endures. The Nile still flows, the sun still rises over deserts and green fields, the stars still glitter above, the names of gods still echo. Ra, Osiris, Isis, Anubis, shadows of beliefs that once bound a civilization. Even in ruin, their monuments whisper of eternity, testaments to a people who saw the fragile world, yet believed it could endure forever through balance. Picture Egypt as they saw it. Dawn breaks over the river, waters shimmering gold, farmers tend fields, children play, priests chant hymns in shadowed halls, Pharaoh offers Makhet to gods. Above, Nut arches jeweled with stars, Geb lies fertile below, Ra sails across the sky, and in the duet Anubis guides the dead, while Apophis rides in darkness. All is fragile, yet all endures. Life flows, death comes, eternity holds. The myths of Egypt remind us still, existence is a balance between order and chaos, fate and choice, time and eternity. To live truthfully is to align with the cosmos. To act unjustly is to fall into shadow. These lessons, carved in stone and sung in hymns, echo across millennia. For the Egyptians, eternity was not distant dream, but daily practice. Each sunrise was proof that order triumphed, each harvest that life endured, each burial that death was not end. Through devotion, ritual, and truth, they found eternity in both cycles and stillness. Thus the story closes, yet it does not end. Like Ra's voyage, like the Nile's flood, like the stars above, it returns always, reminding us that balance must be renewed, that life and death are woven, that eternity is near. From the first mound rising from Nun to the endless cycles of sun and stars, Egyptian myth told a single truth. Existence was fragile, yet eternal, always threatened by chaos, always renewed through balance. Gods and mortals alike upheld Makhet, binding themselves to a cosmos where every dawn was victory, every death a passage, every life a thread in eternity. Their stories were not only legends but lessons, that truth endures, that order must be guarded, and that even in darkness, renewal waits. And though temples have crumbled and voices faded, the myths still live, etched in stone, whispered in papyrus, carried across time. They remind us that eternity is not distant but present in each cycle, each choice, each act of truth. To walk with Egypt's gods is to glimpse the eternal, to feel the fragile yet unbroken rhythm of life itself. If you've journeyed with me through these candlelit stories, consider subscribing so we can keep this flame alive and continue exploring the ancient worlds together.